I was sitting in my truck outside Hartwell's when Tim called. The building took up most of the view through the windshield. It was 9 stories of broken windows, stained concrete, and sections that had folded inward like someone had leaned on them too hard. A chain-link fence ran around the property. There were signs on it about demolition and trespassing, though most of the signs had been torn or faded by the weather. Beyond the fence, weeds pushed through cracks in the pavement. My phone showed Tim's name, then lost the signal before I could answer. It rang again. I picked it up. "Yeah?" There was a burst of static. Then Tim's voice came through low and rough.
Eugene?
"Yeah, I got you.
You still outside Hartwell's?
I'm looking at it." The signal broke apart again. I waited. Tim came back a second later, though his words sounded like they were traveling through a pipe.
I've got a job.
"What kind?"
Salvage, copper, fixtures, whatever metal comes loose before the wrecking crew gets there.
"When?"
Now. They start demolition in June.
I looked through the windshield at the upper floors. One corner of the building had collapsed into the atrium, leaving a dark opening that ran from somewhere near the roof down into the lower levels. It was hard to tell where the floors ended and the debris began. "How bad?"
Bad enough.
"That doesn't tell me much."
It's half collapsed. Power isn't dependable. 2 crews already walked.
The call went quiet for a moment. I could hear traffic moving along Woodward behind me. A bus hissed at the curb, then pulled away. Tim's breathing came through the phone. "What's the pay?" I asked.
Double scale.
"How long?"
Until it's done or until the wrecking crew shows up.
"That's not a length of time."
It's the length you've got.
I rubbed my thumb across the cracked edge of my phone. The mortgage was 6 weeks behind. Beverly had stopped leaving the past due notices on the counter because there wasn't any point. We both knew what they said. Leonard's medical bill was overdue too, and Angela still needed things that didn't look important until you started adding them up. Food, shoes, school costs. "I need the money," I said.
I know.
"You know because Beverly called you?"
No. I know because nobody takes this job for the view.
He never made a hard thing sound better than it was. "What's the catch?"
There's one condition.
"There's always a condition."
4th floor. Old bridal department. You leave the mirror alone.
I looked at Hartwell's again. I couldn't see the 4th floor from where I was parked, not clearly. "What mirror?"
Full-length mirror, bolted to a support column.
"And?"
You don't touch it. You don't move it. You don't clean it.
I wasn't planning on cleaning anything.
You work with it behind you. You never face it.
The connection crackled hard enough that I pulled the phone away from my ear. When I put it back, Tim was still talking. "Look, Tim, if you're going to put a rule on part of this job, tell me why."
Because it's dangerous.
"Everything in there is dangerous."
Not like that.
I waited for more. Tim didn't give it to me. I had known him long enough to recognize when he was avoiding an answer. He'd pause before the part he didn't want to say, then make the warning sound like the explanation. It worked on some people. I'd seen it work on me before. "What happens if I look at it?"
You don't.
That isn't what I asked. "If it shows your reflection doing something before you do, you leave." "How far before?" "Half a second, maybe less." I didn't say anything. Tim continued. "You leave right away. Don't go back for your tools. My tools cost more than this truck." "Then leave the truck too." "Tim," I said, "what's in that mirror?" "Don't face it." "Tim, if it moves ahead of you, you leave." "That's it?" "That's it." I looked back at Hartwell's fence. The gate was chained shut, though I could see tire tracks leading through the dirt beside it. Somebody had been getting in and out. "I'll take it," I said. Tim didn't answer right away. The silence was longer this time. "You sure?" "I need the job." "That isn't the same thing." "It is today." He told me where to sign the demolition waiver and said he'd bring the paperwork to the fence. A few minutes later, he came over carrying a clipboard. He looked at the building before he looked at me. The waiver was printed on several pages. Unsafe structure. No guarantee of power, personal responsibility for injury or death. I'd signed papers like that before. They always made it sound like getting hurt was a personal choice you made after reading carefully. I laid the pages across the hood of my truck. The metal was warm from the afternoon sun, though the wind coming off the street had a cold edge to it. Tim held the clipboard still while I signed. "Fourth floor," he said. "I heard you. Behind you." "I heard you, Tim." He nodded. Then he took the paperwork back and walked toward the fence. I called Beverly before I went inside. She answered from home. I could hear dishes moving in the background and Angela talking somewhere farther away.
You took it?
She asked. "Yeah."
How much?
"Double scale." She didn't say anything for a second. Beverly was good with numbers. She could take a number apart in her head and tell you what would be left before I'd finished saying it.
How long will you be gone?
"Until the work is done."
Eugene.
"I know."
The mortgage is 6 weeks behind. Leonard's bill is overdue. They called again.
"I know."
And you're taking a job in a building that's already half fallen down?
"Look, Beverly, I know what needs doing. I'll finish it and I'll bring the doubled pay home."
You don't know that.
"I'm telling you I will." In the background, Leonard asked if I was working that night. His voice was quiet. I heard Angela ask if she could wait up for me.
No,
Beverly said.
he'll be late.
"I won't be that late," I said.
That's not what you promised.
"I'm coming home." Beverly exhaled. It was the sound she made when she had more to say and knew none of it would change anything.
Be careful,
she said. "I will." I ended the call and sat there for a little while with the phone in my hand. Then I put on my utility jacket, checked the tools in the back seat, and went to the fence. Hartwell's was darker inside than it had looked from the street. Tim had set up temporary work lights on the ground floor, but they only reached as far as the old service counters. Beyond that, the store disappeared into shadow. Dust covered the floors and display cases. Somewhere above, wind moved through the collapsed atrium and made the building creak. I started at a service counter near the main entrance. The copper trim had been installed in long strips, and most of it came loose once I got the pry bar underneath. I cut the pieces down with snips and dropped them into a plastic bin. It was regular work. That was the good part. Metal didn't care about the building's history. It didn't care who had been there before me. You found the fasteners, worked them loose, and carried the useful parts out. I'd been at it for maybe 20 minutes when something scraped across a floor above me. It moved slowly, not a bang or a crack. A heavy drag that started somewhere over my head and traveled toward the far side of the building. It sounded like a piece of furniture being pulled across concrete by someone who didn't have the strength to lift it. I stopped with the pry bar in my hand. The sound ended. I looked toward the open stairwell. The temporary lights didn't reach it. The stairs rose through the dark with sections of railing missing. "Hello?" My voice went up into the building and came back smaller. Nobody answered. I waited another few seconds. The wind moved through the atrium, carrying dust across the floor. I figured that was what I'd heard. A sheet of metal, a door, something loose being pushed along by air. I went back to the counter and kept stripping copper. By the time the first shift ended, the service counter was bare beneath the temporary work lights, and the unanswered scraping had stopped above me. I left Hartwell's after the first shift and came back about 10 hours later. May 13th had started by then, though the sky was still gray. I'd slept for a few hours, showered, and changed my shirt. That was about it. The work was still waiting. I carried my tools through the fence and took them up the stairs. The building felt different in daylight, but not safer. The temporary lights were off on the ground floor, and most of the place was gray from the weak sun coming through the broken windows. Dust covered everything. My boots left dark marks through it as I crossed toward the stairwell. I'd spent the night on the lower floors, stripping copper from counters and fixtures. I'd heard more sounds above me, though nothing happened that gave me a reason to leave. The stairs were missing pieces in a few places. I kept one hand against the wall and went up slowly, stepping around loose concrete and strips of exposed wiring. The fourth floor took a while to reach. The building had shifted enough that some of the landings didn't line up right anymore. You'd climb what looked like a full flight and find yourself standing beside a wall where the next opening used to be. I found the bridal department at the end of a wide corridor. The sign had fallen off the wall, but the shape of the letters was still visible in the dust behind it. Bridal. There were mannequins everywhere. Most of them had no heads. A few had one arm still attached, though the hands were gone. They stood in torn dresses or leaned against walls with their plastic bodies scratched and gray. Some had fallen across the floor. One was lying face down beneath a collapsed display case. The wedding dresses had rotted in place. Lace hung from broken racks in long yellow strips. There were veils mixed in with the dust, and pieces of white fabric trapped under the glass from the display cases. The whole department looked like somebody had held a wedding and forgotten to clean up afterward. I kept the mirror behind me. Tim had been clear about that. I didn't face it. I didn't move it. I didn't clean it. I worked with my back turned toward the column and moved sideways along the walls whenever I needed to get past something. The mirror was tall enough to show a person from head to toe. I knew that because I'd seen the edge of it near the entrance. The frame was dark wood, bolted to one of the support columns. The glass looked clean compared to everything around it. I didn't look again. There was copper trim running along the wall beneath a row of old display windows. The fasteners were rusted, and the trim came free when I worked the pry bar underneath. I worked from left to right, keeping my shoulders turned away from the mirror. Whenever I had to shift position, I checked the floor first. The last thing I wanted was to trip over a headless mannequin and fall backward into something I was trying not to see. The department was quiet except for the tools. Metal scraping against plaster. The pop of a screw pulling free. Dust dropping into my hair and onto the shoulders of my jacket. I had stripped maybe 6 feet of trim when something caught my attention behind me. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a change in the light. A cracked piece of window glass lay on the floor near my boot. Part of the old display window had broken loose from the frame, and the shard was sitting at an angle against a chunk of concrete. The glass caught the daylight and threw it across the wall behind me. It also caught the mirror. I saw the reflection in the shard without looking toward the column. The angle was bad and the glass was dirty, but I could make out the room in pieces. The column. The broken cases, the mannequins standing around the department. Then I saw the bride. She was standing near the far wall, maybe 10 feet behind me, maybe more. The shard only showed part of the mirror, so I couldn't tell exactly where she was supposed to be. The mannequin was wearing a complete wedding gown. It had a long white skirt, a fitted top, and a veil that went over the shoulders. The head was still missing, but the body was turned toward me. One arm hung at its side. The other was raised a little, as if it had started to reach out and stopped. I stared at the shard. The real room was behind me. I knew what was there. A bare mannequin stood near the wall with its back turned. I'd passed it when I came in. It had no dress, no arms, and no head. The dress in the reflection wasn't on the floor either. There was nothing white near that wall except a strip of lace caught beneath the display case. I should have left. If it showed my reflection doing something before I did, I left. Tim had said it more than once because he knew I'd try to find a way around it. The mannequin wasn't my reflection. That was the first thing I told myself. I turned. Instead, I put one hand on the pry bar and turned my head, then my shoulders, then the rest of me. The mannequin was where I'd seen it. It was bare, headless, and facing the wall. The wall behind it was stained with water damage. There was a dark line running down from the ceiling, and a length of torn lace rested on the floor near its feet. The display case beside it had collapsed inward. Nothing was wearing a dress. I looked back at the window shard. The bride was still there. There were small buttons down the back and lace around the sleeves. The veil covered the empty place where the head should have been, though the fabric had pulled forward as if something beneath it was leaning toward me. The figure was facing me. I took one step away from the glass. The bride didn't move. Neither did the reflection of the room around it. If the image had changed, I could have blamed the angle or the light. But the shard showed the same broken department and the same dressed mannequin standing where the real one wasn't. I picked up the window shard. It was about the size of my hand, with one sharp corner missing. I wrapped it in a piece of torn cloth from the floor and put it in my jacket pocket. I faced the wall again and worked the pry bar under the copper. I didn't look toward the mirror again. I worked by feel when I had to, running my fingers along the edge of the trim until I found the next fastener. I used the pry bar carefully and caught each piece before it fell. The work took longer that way, but I wasn't going to turn around for a better angle. Every few minutes, I felt the urge to check the shard. I didn't. I kept my hand away from my pocket and concentrated on the wall. There were times when the building seemed to move around me. There was a low creak above the ceiling, then another one from somewhere along the corridor. I finished the wall. The last piece of copper came free with a sharp snap. I cut it down and put it in the bin with the rest. Then I picked up my pry bar and backed away from the column without turning my head. I kept my eyes on the floor until I reached the corridor. After that, I walked straight to the stairs. I carried the tools against my side and kept one hand over the pocket holding the glass. Outside, the daylight was stronger. The fence cast a long shadow over the pavement, and traffic moved along the street beyond it like Hartwell's was just another building people had decided not to look at. I stepped through the gate with the cracked window shard in my pocket and the fourth-floor mirror behind me. I didn't sleep much after leaving Hartwell's. I got home, showered, and spent a few hours in bed with the cracked piece of glass on the nightstand. I kept telling myself I'd throw it away in the morning. I didn't. By the time I got back to the fence, the sky had turned pale over Woodward. Traffic was already moving past the store, and the broken windows caught the morning light in scattered pieces. Hartwell's looked almost normal from the road. I had the copper in a plastic bin and the shard wrapped in the same piece of cloth I'd used the day before. The glass was small enough to fit in my palm. I kept my eyes off the side that had shown me the bride. Tim was standing beside the gate. He had a paper cup in one hand and his canvas jacket pulled tight against the cold. He looked at the bin first. "You get the fourth floor?" "Some of it." "How much?" "Enough to fill this." I set the bin down near his boots. The copper pieces had been cut into shorter lengths and packed together with strips of trim. Tim looked inside without bending over. He didn't seem interested in checking the work. "You go near the mirror?" "No. That isn't what I asked." I kept the cloth wrapped around the shard. I saw it. Tim stopped looking at the copper. "Where?" "In a piece of window glass. I never turned around." He waited. "It showed a mannequin in a wedding dress," I said. The real mannequin was headless and bare. The one in the glass had a dress and a veil. Tim put his paper cup on top of the fence post. He didn't touch the bin. "That's part of the mirror." It was a piece of window. It showed you what the mirror wanted shown. I held the wrapped glass up between us. "Then explain it." He looked past me at the building. The bridal department was hard to see from the street, but I knew where to find it. Somewhere behind the broken windows and the dark sections of wall, the mirror was still bolted to its column. Tim rubbed his thumb across the side of his cup. "Hartwell's had a bridal department up there, before it closed. Dresses, fittings, all of it. The mirror was part of the room." "That doesn't explain the mannequin." "No." "Tim." He looked at me then, not at my face, at the hand holding the glass. Julie Chandler was killed in that department. The name sat between us for a moment. I didn't know Julie. I'd never heard of her before Tim said it, but the way he paused before her name made it sound like the building did. "When?" 1961. "During the fitting?" "On the day of it." He picked up the paper cup again, though he didn't drink from it. She was getting ready for her wedding. Her fiancé came in and killed her, in front of the mirror. Why? Tim's eyes moved back toward Hartwell's. You don't need the reason. I asked for it. You asked what the mirror does. I'm asking what happened. That's the same mistake. I stared at him. Tim had a way of turning an answer into another warning. What did he do? He cut her throat. Tim said it plainly. I looked at the glass in my hand. The bride's veil had covered the empty neck of the mannequin. I hadn't seen a face, but I remembered the way the fabric had leaned toward me. What happened after? The store sealed the department. Sealed it how? They bricked up the entrances and covered the windows. They moved the racks and cases out through the back, then closed it. And the mirror? They left it. Why? People don't always remove the part that causes the trouble. It was bolted to a support column. They couldn't get it loose without damaging the floor and the column. Hartwell's didn't want anyone asking why the room had been opened again, so they built the wall around the department and left the glass where it was. I looked through the fence at the store. The wind moved a piece of plastic caught in the upper railing. It snapped against the metal and went still. They bricked up a murder room and left the mirror inside. That's what I said. Didn't anybody check it? People checked it. Who? Workers, inspectors, anyone who had a reason to go up there. Then why is the mirror still there? Tim turned his cup slowly in his hand. Because people who look at it don't always come back down. Traffic moved behind us. A delivery truck rattled over a patch in the street, and the sound faded toward the overpass. Tim continued before I could ask again. The mirror doesn't just show what's in front of it, it shows what's about to happen. A hand reaching for a door, someone turning their head, a person taking a step. Half a second early. Sometimes. That's what it showed me. What did you see? Not me. That doesn't matter. It matters if the rule is about seeing yourself. Tim looked at the shard again. You saw the room change. That's enough. I had the piece of cloth folded around my fingers. The glass pressed through it with a hard little edge. I could have put it back in my pocket. I could have dropped it through the fence and watched it break against the pavement. Instead, I held it out. Tim didn't take it. Look, I said, I'm not asking you to make this sound reasonable. I'm asking what happens next. If the mirror shows you doing something, you do it. That's not an explanation. It isn't meant to be. Tim, it compels you. The word sounded wrong coming from him. I'd seen the bride in the shard. I'd seen the dress where there wasn't one. But wrong and compelled weren't the same thing. How? You see yourself do something in the reflection. Then your body follows it. Right away? Yes. Even if I know it's going to happen, knowing doesn't stop it. What if I look away? You already looked. I didn't see myself. You don't need to. He took a sip from the cup. The coffee must have been cold by then, but his face didn't change. The last worker who faced it saw himself walk to the window, Tim said. He watched the reflection open it, and then watched himself step through. I raised my eyes toward the upper floors. The store had no glass left in most of the windows, just open spaces with bent frames and dark rooms behind them. He jumped? He walked. That's what you said. He walked off the building. The words were simple. Did he know what he was seeing? He knew enough to turn away. And then? He still went to the window. Did you see it? No. He looked down at the bin of copper. Who did? Doesn't matter. It matters to me. You want to work or you want a history lesson? I felt anger then. I want to know what you sent me into. You knew it was dangerous. I knew the building was falling down. I didn't know it had a mirror that made people walk out of windows. Now you know. That's supposed to fix it? No. He said it without any expression. Tim never dressed up bad news. That had been useful when I first started working for him. You could trust the bad news because he didn't waste time dressing it up. I put the shard in my jacket pocket. Tim watched me do it. You should get rid of that. I might need it. For what? To know what's behind me without turning around. That's not safe. Neither is the department. You leave the 4th floor. I looked at the bin. The copper was worth money. Not enough to solve everything, but enough to make a payment and buy some time. Beverly would know exactly how far it went. Leonard's bill was already overdue. Angela needed shoes for school. The mortgage notices were still somewhere in the house, even if Beverly had stopped leaving them on the counter. Beverly had asked how long I'd be gone. Leonard had wanted to know if I was working that night. Angela had wanted to wait up. I can finish the floor, I said. Tim didn't respond. I'll work with the mirror behind me. I won't face it, won't look at the glass. I can finish the copper. You already looked. Not at myself. That's not the rule. It's the rule you gave me. He lowered his eyes. Tim, I said, I'm not going up there blind. I know what it does now. I know what to avoid. You don't know what it does. I know enough. No. I'm going back in. He stood there with the cup in his hand and the fence between us. For a second, I thought he might tell me to leave the copper and go home. Instead, he looked toward the building again. Keep the mirror behind you. I will. Don't use the glass. I won't. If you see yourself move, you leave. I know. Eugene. I waited. Don't go back for anything. I know what needs doing. He didn't answer. I bent down and lifted the bin, then held the wrapped shard out to him with my other hand. I'm not keeping this. Tim took the cloth and glass first. His fingers closed around it without looking down. Then he reached for the copper. He took the copper from me and turned away without meeting my eyes. I spent the next couple of hours going through the lower floors and checking what was left. Tim had taken the copper and the piece of glass, but I still had my pry bar, snips, gloves, and the small tool bag I carried everywhere. I figured I could keep working while he decided whether he wanted to tell me the rest. Hartwell's was quiet when I went back in. The afternoon light came through the shattered panes in thin gray strips, and dust moved through it whenever the wind reached the open atrium. I took the stairs toward the 3rd floor with my tools in one hand. The veil was hanging from the stairwell rail. It was white, or close enough to white that it stood out against the concrete. The fabric draped over the metal railing and fell down the inside of the stairs in a long, loose curve. One end had caught around a bolt. The rest of it hung toward the lower floor. I stopped a few steps below it. I'd cleared that stairwell the night before. There had been broken plaster, a piece of pipe, and some old wiring twisted around the railing. No veil. I would have remembered a veil. Even in a bridal department, you don't expect to find one floating around on the 3rd floor after the room has been empty for decades. I reached up and pulled it free. The fabric was damp. Not wet enough to drip, but cold and heavy in my hand. There was a faint smell to it that reminded me of old flowers left in a vase too long. I figured another worker had brought it in from somewhere and left it there. I rolled the veil into a loose bundle and carried it outside. I left it beside the fence near the place where Tim had set down his cup. Then I went back in. The 3rd floor had been stripped almost completely. There were bare counters along one wall and empty spaces where cabinets or display cases had been. I'd taken most of the useful metal out myself. The rest was cracked flooring, dust and debris underfoot. Orange blossoms were scattered across the concrete. They were small and white, with green stems and dark leaves. Some had been crushed under a boot. Others sat in little groups near the counters. They looked like they'd been cut that morning. The petals were clean. Water clung to them. I picked one up. It was wet enough that the stem slipped between my fingers. The room had been dry when I came through earlier. There were no working pipes on that floor and no rain coming through the roof. I looked up anyway. The ceiling was broken in a few places, but the concrete above was dry. I dropped the flower. A cake sat on one of the counters. That counter had been empty. I'd stripped it down to the surface the night before and swept the loose dust off with my glove. Now there was a white cake sitting near the far end, covered in real frosting. The frosting had started to collapse down the sides. A thin line of it had reached the counter and hardened there. I walked over and touched the edge with one finger. It was soft. The cake smelled sweet and sour at the same time. There were no crumbs around it, no box, no paper, no dust disturbed on the counter. It looked like somebody had carried it into the room and set it down carefully without touching anything else. I didn't eat it. I was hungry, and it was a cake. Then I looked at the frosting sliding down the side and lost interest. I went back toward the stairs. There were footprints on the second floor. They crossed a storage room that had been bare when I left it. The prints were small. A woman's shoes, I figured. The soles had left dark, wet marks across the concrete. Each step was clear enough to show the narrow heel and the shape of the front. The room itself was dry. I followed the prints until they reached the doorway. They crossed the room, turned near the far wall, and ended at the stairs leading toward the fourth floor. I checked the rest of the room. There were no other tracks. Nothing came in from the corridor. Nothing went out through the broken window. The footprints just stopped. I stood there for a while looking at them. Then I went into the storage room. The tools were arranged in rows. There were pry bars, hammers, snips, gloves, and a portable drill with its battery removed. Everything had been cleaned off and set parallel to the wall. The tools weren't stacked or thrown down the way people leave them when they're in a hurry. 2 crews worth, I thought. A hard hat sat beside the last row. The name Terrence was marked across the front in black letters. I'd seen it before near the service area below, though I hadn't paid much attention to it at the time. There was a dark stain inside the lining. I picked up the hat by the rim and turned it over. The stain had dried into the fabric. It wasn't large, but it was too dark and too even to be dirt. I carried the hard hat outside. Tim was still at the fence. He had moved the copper bin closer to his truck and was standing with his back to Hartwell's. The veil lay on the pavement between us. He looked at the hat in my hand and then at me. "What's that?" "I found it upstairs." He didn't reach for it. I held it out anyway. "You know Kingston?" Tim's face changed slightly. "Leave the tools where they are." I asked about Kingston. "Leave them." "Tim." He glanced back. The windows behind him were dark, and wind rattled the fence in short bursts. "Kingston Munoz," I said. "That the man who wore this?" Tim didn't answer. I looked down at the hard hat. There was a stain inside. "You don't touch the tools. You sent 2 crews in there before me. They didn't walk out of Hartwell's." He said it without raising his voice. "What does that mean?" "It means you leave the tools." "Kingston, did he leave on his own?" Tim's eyes stayed on the floors above us. "Tim," he finally looked at me. "You want to know what happened? Get away from the building first." "I'm standing outside." "Not far enough." The answer made me angry. I felt it in my chest and in the hand holding the hard hat. "You knew this was happening. I knew the building was dangerous. You knew workers had disappeared. Watch your footing. Look, Tim, I'm asking you a straight question, and I'm telling you to leave." "That isn't the same thing." "No." Behind him, Hartwell's creaked. It was a long sound from somewhere above the 3rd floor. Tim glanced back at the building, and for a second, neither of us said anything. Then he pointed at the storage rooms. "Put it back." "I'm not putting this back." "Put it back, Eugene." "You want me to put a stained hard hat back beside the tools and act like nobody was here?" "I want you to leave the tools alone. You're hiding what happened to them." Tim's mouth tightened. "They didn't leave Hartwell's voluntarily," he said again. "That's all you've got?" "That's enough." "It isn't enough for me." "You're still here." That stopped me for a moment. I was still there because I needed the money. The mortgage didn't care about the mirror. Leonard's bill didn't care about the footprints. I set the hard hat on the ground near the veil. "Tell me what that mirror's connected to." Tim's eyes moved to the veil. "Everything you found." The building creaked again. He picked up the veil and threw it over the fence. It landed in the weeds on the other side. "Go home," he said. I looked at the 2nd floor windows. "I'm going back in. I said. Tim shook his head. I know what needs doing. You don't know that. I know what I owe. He didn't answer. I picked up my tool bag and the pry bar. The hard hat stayed beside the fence. I left it there, with the tools still inside Hartwell's and the stain hidden beneath the lining. Then I walked through the gate and carried my tools back into Hartwell's. I spent the rest of the night inside Hartwell's because I didn't have much choice. The truck wouldn't start, my phone had no signal, and the temporary lights had gone out sometime after I came back in. I kept working with a flashlight until the batteries started fading, then found a place near the service area and waited for daylight. I got home the next morning and slept for a few hours. Beverly had already left for work by the time I woke up. There was a note on the counter asking me to call her. I put the phone beside the sink while I showered, then forgot about it until I was halfway back to Hartwell's. By May 15th, I'd stopped expecting the building to act like a normal place. I came back with my tools and a fresh set of batteries. The lower floors were dark, but the work lights came on when I switched them. I checked the truck before going inside. It started without a problem. That made me feel better for about 10 minutes. The day passed without anything moving where it shouldn't. I went through the third floor again and found the veil gone from the fence. The orange blossoms were brown now. The cake had collapsed into a flat white mess on the counter. I didn't touch any of it. By evening, I was standing in the fourth floor stairwell with my phone against my ear. I'd been trying to reach Beverly since I left the house. The first calls rang without connecting. Then the signal disappeared. After that, the phone showed one bar, then none. I tried again anyway. The battery had been nearly full when I entered Hartwell's. Now the screen went black in my hand. I pressed the power button. Nothing happened. I held it down longer. The phone stayed dead. That was when the work lights flickered below me. The light came back for a second, then went out across the whole floor. Hartwell's dropped into darkness. I stood still and listened. Traffic moved along the street outside. Somewhere in the building, water dripped into a metal pan or an old sink. The sound came once, then stopped. I went down the stairs with my flashlight on. The beam shook across the walls as I moved. It wasn't fear. I was tired, and the building had trained me to pay attention to every small change. You didn't get to ignore things at Hartwell's. Outside, the streetlights on the block were out too. The stores across the road had gone dark, and the traffic signals were blinking red at the intersection. My truck sat behind the fence with the lights off. I climbed in and turned the key. The engine clicked once. I tried again. Another click. Then nothing. The battery had worked that morning. I'd driven from home and parked beside the gate. It wasn't old enough to fail without warning, and I hadn't left anything running. I tried the headlights. They came on weakly, then faded. I tried the key again anyway. Nothing. I got out and stood in the cold air beside the truck. There were still cars moving on the main road, but Hartwell sat in the middle of everything with no lights and no sound from inside. Tim kept a spare radio in the site trailer. It was an old construction radio with a cracked plastic case and a short antenna. I'd used it once during the first shift. It didn't reach very far, but it could reach the gate, and the gate was better than nothing. The trailer door was unlocked. That bothered me before I even opened it. Tim usually locked the trailer when he left, even if he was only going across the lot. He kept paperwork in there along with tools and fuel cans. None of it was worth much, but Tim locked up like someone who expected things to disappear. The radio was on the desk where he kept the work orders. I picked it up and checked the batteries. They were still in place. I turned the dial. The speaker gave me a burst of static. Tim was sitting in the corner. I didn't see him at first because the trailer was dark. The flashlight caught his shoes, then the black trousers, then the front of his jacket. He was wearing a tuxedo. It was a real one. Black jacket, black vest, white shirt, a narrow tie pulled tight under his throat. The clothes looked too clean for Hartwell's and too formal for Tim. I'd never seen him own anything like it. He looked like somebody had taken a man from a wedding photograph and left him in a job trailer. He was staring at the wall. Tim. His eyes moved toward me, but not all the way. They looked glassy, not tired, not drunk, just fixed on something that wasn't in the trailer. "What are you doing in here?" He didn't answer. I held up the radio. "The power's out. My phone's dead. The truck won't start." Tim looked at the radio instead of me. "It's almost time," he said. I waited. Tim. "Julie's been waiting 50 years for somebody to finish the wedding." He said it like he was reading a line from a form. There wasn't much feeling in his voice, but there was something underneath it. The glass had held that same stillness when the bride stood where the mannequin should have been. "Who is Julie?" He blinked once. "Julie. That's not an answer. She's waiting." "For what?" "For the ceremony." I stepped farther into the trailer. The door swung shut behind me, and the latch clicked into place. Tim didn't move. The tuxedo had a dark stain near one cuff. I couldn't tell if it was dirt or old blood. "Look at me," I said. He did. "The mirror did this?" Tim's mouth tightened. "It started before you." "Who?" "The crews. The workers you said didn't leave?" He looked down at his hands. They were resting on his knees, palms open. "The mirror never let them leave." That was different from what he'd told me outside. He'd said they didn't walk out voluntarily. He'd said enough to make me understand they were gone, but not enough to put a shape around it. "Where are they?" Tim looked toward the trailer door. "Don't ask it questions." "I'm asking you." "You go near the mirror, you leave." "You told me that already." "Then listen this time." I gripped the radio harder. Kingston was one of them. Tim paused before the name. "Kingston. What happened to him?" "He was taken." "Taken where?" Tim stood up. He moved slowly and carefully, as if his body had decided before he did. He saw the window. "Did he jump?" "No." Tim walked past me toward the door. "Then what happened?" "He became the groom." I caught the door before he could open it. "You said the mirror made him walk out." "I said he went to the window." "That isn't the same thing." "No." "Tim, what does it mean to become the groom?" He looked at me. His eyes were still fixed and bright, but there was recognition in them now. For a second, he seemed like the man who had stood beside the fence and warned me not to use the glass. Then he looked away. "It's almost time." He opened the door and stepped outside. I followed him with the radio in my hand. I didn't know if it worked. I didn't know if anyone was listening. But if Tim reached the 4th floor and turned toward the mirror, I'd be alone in a powerless building with no phone, no truck, and no way to call for help. The radio hissed as I walked. Tim crossed the lot without looking back. His boots struck the pavement in a steady rhythm. The black jacket moved against his shoulders, and the white shirt showed beneath it like a piece of paper. "Tim." He kept walking. "Tim, stop." He didn't stop. He reached the building and went through the opening in the fence. The stairwell was ahead of us, dark above the first landing. I followed him inside. The radio gave another burst of static. I tapped the side with my palm. It didn't help. Tim started up the stairs. "Listen," I said. "You don't know what you're doing." He kept climbing. "Tim." He put one hand on the railing. The stairwell smelled like dust, damp concrete, and something sweet that didn't belong there. Orange blossoms, maybe. Or flowers that had been left in a vase too long. Tim reached the base of the 4th floor stairs and turned toward the first step. I caught him by the arm and tried to pull him back. He stopped when I pulled on his arm, but only for a second. His body leaned toward the stairs like the rest of him was already somewhere above us. I tightened my grip. "Tim!" He looked at me. His face was calm, but his eyes weren't focused on mine. "You leave," he said. "You're not going anywhere. Not with me." "That's what I'm saying." The mirror slammed against the support column above us. The sound filled the stairwell. It was like a sheet of metal being dropped from the roof, only louder and closer. The railing jumped under my hand. Dust came down from the ceiling and covered my shoulders. Tim pulled against me. I held on. Then something moved in the dark below. The mannequins had been standing along the lower landings and near the old display rooms. I'd noticed them before, but not closely. Most were missing heads or arms. Some had been pushed against the walls with their backs turned toward the stairs. Now they turned. The movement came in pieces. A shoulder shifted. A smooth plaster head rolled toward us. One mannequin dragged its foot across the concrete and stepped into the middle of the landing. Another reached out with both hands and caught the railing. They were facing the stairwell. The lower roots were blocked. I let go of Tim. He went up at once. He didn't run, but he moved faster than he had before. His boots hit the steps with the same steady rhythm they'd had outside the trailer. He still held himself like a man going somewhere he'd agreed to go. I followed with the radio in one hand. The other stayed on the railing. I looked down once and saw the mannequins gathered below us. Their pale faces caught the weak light from my flashlight. A few of them had no faces at all, just flat plaster where the eyes and mouths should have been. "Tim," I said, "stop." He didn't stop. The mannequin nearest the landing raised one arm and placed its hand across the stairwell opening. It wasn't fast. It moved like there was no reason to hurry. I climbed after Tim. The landing on the 4th level opened into the bridal department. The temporary lights stopped short of it, and my flashlight showed only pieces of the room. Empty counters, torn curtains, the dark outlines of display cases. The mirror stood against the support column at the far end. Tim walked straight toward it. The mirror was flat now. Its frame sat tight against the column, and the glass filled from floor to ceiling. I'd seen it from the side before. I'd seen pieces of it in broken windows. The glass showed the room as it had been. There were dresses hanging from racks. White fabric covered the counters. Small lamps burned along the walls. The floor looked clean enough to reflect the light. It was Hartwell's, but it wasn't the Hartwells I knew. The department had been put back together inside the mirror. A wedding was taking place there. I could see people seated beyond the edge of the frame. They all faced the front, though none of them moved. A man stood beside the mirror's center line with his hands folded in front of him. He wore a dark suit. A woman stood next to him in a white wedding gown with a veil over her hair. Julie. I knew it before I saw the name anywhere. I had never met her, but the room carried her the way the building carried old smoke and dust. She was the bride from the glass. The scar at her throat showed beneath the veil, thin and dark against her skin. There was an empty place beside her. Tim reached the edge of the mirror. Tim. He kept walking. The empty place had been waiting for him. There was room beside Julie, a clean space between her and the other people in the reflected department. The other people had left the space beside her empty. Tim stepped toward it. I crossed the room and grabbed him from behind. My arm went around his chest and I pulled as hard as I could. He was lean, but I couldn't get a good grip on him through the tuxedo. His boots dragged over the concrete. For half a second I thought I had him. Then the mirror moved before I did. My reflection was standing behind Tim. It had one hand reaching for him. The reflected hand closed around his shoulder before my own arm finished pulling him back. I watched it happen. I watched myself shove him. The motion reached me a moment later. My arm tightened around Tim, then my shoulder turned, and my hand drove into the middle of his back. I didn't choose to do it. Tim stumbled forward. His heel caught on a strip of broken flooring, and he threw one hand out to catch himself. I tried to pull him back, but my arm kept moving. The force went through me like I was operating a tool I couldn't set down. Tim fell against the space in front of the mirror. I got control of my hand then. It happened all at once. My fingers opened. My shoulder stopped. I leaned forward and caught the back of his jacket. "Tim." He twisted around. "Don't touch me. You're not going in there. I'm already there." "No." I pulled him backward. The mirror rippled. It didn't break. The surface bent around the place where Tim's hand had touched it. The wedding inside the glass stayed still, but Julie turned her head toward us. Her eyes found me through the reflection. She raised one hand. The hand passed through the mirror. It came out slowly at first, wrist and fingers pushing through the glass as if the surface were thick water. Her sleeve followed. White fabric, pale skin, a thin silver ring on one finger. The hand reached for the nearest man. That was me. I pulled Tim toward my chest and stepped back. Julie's fingers stretched across the space between us. They were close enough that I could see the dirt beneath one fingernail. Then the mannequins moved. They came from behind us and from the sides of the room. I hadn't heard them cross the floor. One seized Tim's left arm. Another took his right. A third locked both hands around his waist. The plaster fingers pressed into the tuxedo. Tim looked at me. Eugene. I grabbed him around the middle. The radio dropped from my hand and struck the floor. Static poured out of it. I planted my boots and pulled backward as the mannequins dragged him ahead. They pulled harder than I could. They didn't have muscles. They didn't have faces that could strain or mouths that could breathe. Their arms stayed straight as they pulled him toward the glass. Tim's shoes scraped against the concrete. Help me. I've got you. I had my arms around him and both hands locked together over his stomach. The tuxedo fabric was smooth beneath my fingers. I pulled until my back hurt. The mannequin holding his left arm twisted him sideways. His shoulder jerked, and his head struck the side of one of the empty display cases. Tim. Eugene, help me. I'm helping you. I pulled again. For a moment, Tim stopped moving. His boots caught against the edge of the floor where the bridal department had sunk lower than the hallway. I thought I could get him free. Then more hands closed around him. They came from the darkness near the racks. White hands, gray hands. Some belonged to mannequins with heads. Some reached out from bodies that had no heads at all. They took hold of Tim's jacket, his arms, his legs. The combined pull tore him out of my grip. My fingers slipped across the back of his shirt. I caught the edge of his jacket and held on. The fabric stretched under the weight. A button popped free and bounced over the concrete. Tim. He was almost at the mirror. His face had changed now. The calm was gone. He finally understood what was happening. Don't let it take me. I'm not letting go. The jacket tore. I fell backward with a piece of black cloth in my hand. Tim slid toward the mirror and reached for me. His fingers closed around empty air. Julie's hand was still outside the mirror. It moved past him. The mannequins dragged Tim forward. His boots crossed the edge of the glass, and the surface opened around them. It rippled up his legs and over his waist. The tuxedo darkened as it passed through, like the reflection was soaking into the cloth. Tim shouted my name once more. Then the mirror took the rest of him. His shoulders went through. His head turned toward me. I saw his face beside Julie's, close enough that she could have touched him. The reflected wedding waited around them. Nobody in the seats moved. Tim disappeared into the glass beside Julie. The surface settled. The mannequins stood still around the room again. The mannequins were still scattered around the room. The power came back a second later. The lights below us flashed on, then filled the stairwell with a weak yellow glow. The radio on the floor crackled once more, then went quiet. I didn't pick it up. I was looking at the mirror. Tim was gone. Julie was gone too. The glass showed only the room as it was now. Empty counters, torn curtains, dust along the floor. The mirror looked ordinary again. I waited for it to move. It didn't. Their backs faced the mirror now, like they'd finished whatever they came to do. I couldn't tell if they could see me. I had no idea whether they'd ever been alive enough to see anything. I went for the stairs. I didn't bother with the radio. I ran down the first flight, then the next one, keeping one hand on the railing so I wouldn't lose my footing. The mannequins didn't follow me. At least I didn't hear them. My boots hit the steps hard, jarring my knees, but I kept going. The floors below were lit again. The work lights came on one at a time as I passed them. Their cords ran along the concrete and disappeared into dark corners. I crossed the service area and pushed through the gap in the fence. My truck was where I'd left it. The headlights came on when I opened the door. I climbed in, turned the key, and the engine started on the first attempt. That should have made me feel better. It didn't. I backed away from Hartwell's and drove until I found a place with a working phone. There was a city office still open for reports and emergencies. I told them Tim had gone into the building and didn't come back out. The person on the other end asked if I'd seen him leave. No.
Did you search the building?
I was with him. That answer made things quiet for a moment. I explained that the power had gone out, the truck had failed, and Tim had gone upstairs while I was trying to get help. I said I lost sight of him near level 4. I left out the mirror. I left out the mannequins. I left out the wedding and the woman who had reached through the glass. I'd been inside when Tim disappeared. They asked if Tim had been drinking or using anything. I wasn't sure. They asked if we'd argued. I said we'd had a disagreement about the work. That part was true. A report was taken. Someone said a crew would check the site in the morning. I gave them my name and number. Then I drove home. Beverly was awake when I got there. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a sweater pulled around her shoulders. The light above the stove was on, and there was a glass of water near her hand. She looked at my face first. Then she looked at my jacket. What happened? Tim went missing. She paused. Where? Hartwell's. You were with him? Yes. She pushed the water away without drinking it. Then she asked if I was hurt. I told her no. That was mostly true. My back hurt from pulling against the mannequins, and my hands were cut from the glass and the rough concrete, but none of it needed a hospital. She wanted to know what happened. I told her the power went out and Tim went upstairs. I said I followed him, then lost him in the dark. Did you call the police? I called the city. Why the city? It's a demolition site. They handle the property. That doesn't answer me. I looked at the table. There were unpaid envelopes beside the salt shaker. One was from the mortgage company. Another had Leonard's name on it. I gave them the report, I said. Beverly watched me for a while. She didn't believe I'd told her everything. She knew me too well for that. Still, she didn't keep asking. The paycheck came through a few days later. It was double the amount I expected. Tim had said double scale changed the conversation. I'd thought he meant the danger came with a higher rate. I hadn't understood that the money might arrive whether the work was finished or not. I used it before I could change my mind. The mortgage arrears were paid first. The confirmation came through on my phone while Beverly stood beside me at the counter. She checked the amount, then checked it again. She didn't smile. The mortgage had been behind long enough that paying it didn't feel like winning anything. It felt like stopping something from getting worse. Leonard's medical bill took the rest of what it needed. There was still some money left, but not enough to make us comfortable. It would cover groceries and keep the lights on for the next month. Leonard asked if that meant he could go back to the doctor. It means the bill's paid, I told him. Does that mean I'm better? No, it means we can deal with it. He nodded, though I could tell that wasn't the answer he wanted. He said he was okay. He used that word whenever he thought he was causing trouble. Angela was sitting on the floor near the couch with a piece of paper in her lap. She'd drawn a tall building with black windows and a red line across the top. I asked what it was. A house, she said. It looks like Hartwell's. She covered part of the drawing with her hand. It's not. Beverly looked over at her. Angela lowered the paper and asked if Tim was coming back. I couldn't say. She asked why he was missing. I said the building was dangerous. Dangerous like a fire? Something like that. Is the mirror still there? I looked at Beverly. Angela kept watching me. No, I said. That was the first lie I told at home. It wasn't the last. Hartwell's stayed standing for another few weeks. The city put up more fencing and posted new signs. Nobody let me go back inside. I was asked a few questions by people who wanted to know where Tim had gone, and I gave them the same answer each time. He went upstairs. I followed him. The power failed. I lost sight of him. I didn't mention the wedding section. I didn't mention the people I'd seen on an otherwise empty floor. I didn't mention Kingston either, even though I still thought about the hard hat near the fence and the dark stain under its lining. By June, the demolition crew arrived. I watched from across the street with my hands in my jacket pockets. The machines worked through the morning, tearing open the outer walls and dropping sections of Hartwell's into the floors below. Concrete broke apart. Windows burst outward. Dust rolled across the road and covered the parked cars. The building came down in pieces. It took most of the day. The top floor collapsed near the end. The department with the wedding displays fell inward, taking the support column and the rooms around it with it. I expected the mirror to appear in the rubble. Even broken, it should have been there. A frame, a sheet of glass, something. They found glass dust instead. There was no body, no tuxedo, no mannequins, no intact mirror. The workers cleared the debris and loaded it into trucks. Hartwell's became a flat stretch of broken concrete and twisted metal. People drove past it without slowing down. The city closed the file after a while. Tim was listed as missing. Nothing more could be determined. At home, the money made things quieter. Beverly stopped opening the mortgage letters with both hands. The bill was no longer sitting under the salt shaker. Angela went back to drawing houses that looked like houses. I still woke up some nights expecting to hear the radio hiss. I didn't tell Beverly where the paycheck came from. I told her Tim had approved extra hours before he disappeared. That was close enough to the truth that I could say it without stopping. She didn't ask why a missing man had paid me in advance. The paid bill arrived in the mail near the end of the month. Leonard's name was printed across the top, followed by a balance of 0. Beverly set it on the counter while she sorted the rest of the mail. I picked it up and read the amount. Then I placed the receipt beside the mortgage payment confirmation at home. For about 90 days, the receipt stayed on the counter beside the mortgage confirmation. Beverly moved them whenever she cleaned, then put them back in the same place. I didn't ask her to. She seemed to understand that I needed them in sight. Hartwell's was gone by then. The lot had been cleared and fenced again, this time with newer signs and heavier locks. The city stopped calling about Tim. His name came up less often at home, too. The envelope arrived late in the afternoon. Beverly brought the mail in while I sat at the kitchen table. She dropped the bills beside me and kept one envelope in her hand. "This is for you," she said. I looked at it. My name was written across the front in black ink. I knew the handwriting before I turned it over. Tim had written work orders, supply lists, and payment amounts in that same narrow block print. The letters leaned slightly to the right. He pressed hard enough that the paper always had marks on the back. I hadn't seen his handwriting since the last day at Hartwell's. "Who sent it?" Beverly asked. I opened the envelope with my thumb. There was no return address. Inside was a wedding invitation. It was plain white cardstock with a thin black border. There were no flowers or decorations. The words were printed in the middle, but the rest had been filled in by hand. My name was written at the top. Beneath it was an invitation to attend a wedding. There was no bride's name. No groom's name either, unless mine was supposed to cover that part. The card asked for an RSVP and left a blank line for the location. No date, no time, no address. Beverly stood on the other side of the table and watched me read it. "Who is it from?" "Tim." She looked at the card. "That doesn't say Tim. I know his handwriting. Tim is missing." "I know that too." She took the invitation from me and read it herself. Her eyes moved over the printed words, then down to the empty line where a place should have been written. She turned the card over. The back was blank. "Maybe somebody found his things," she said. "Maybe." Did the city send this? No. Then who did? I didn't have an answer. That was the problem with most questions about Hartwell's. The building had always had an answer. It just wasn't one that helped. Beverly put the card on the counter beside the paid bills. She didn't throw it away. I didn't tell her to. That night I brushed my teeth and looked into the bathroom mirror. I saw myself standing there in my thermal shirt with a toothbrush in my hand. My reflection was wearing a black tuxedo. I stopped moving. The reflection kept its arm raised. The white shirt and narrow tie were the same ones Tim had worn in the trailer. The jacket fit close across the shoulders. I'd never owned a tuxedo, and I'd never worn one. Even for our wedding, I'd worn a dark suit that didn't fit right around the neck. The reflection lowered the toothbrush. I didn't. It moved a moment before I did, maybe half a second. My hand came down after its hand had stopped. The reflected man looked at me through the glass. Then he looked normal again. I stayed there, listening to the house. The bathroom fan rattled above me. Water ran somewhere inside the wall. Everything else in the house sounded ordinary, which made the mirror worse. I turned off the light and left the bathroom. Beverly was in the bedroom folding clothes. She had the television on low, but she wasn't watching it. She looked up when I came through the door. What happened? Nothing. Eugene. I stopped beside the bed. The mirror moved first. She waited. It showed me in a tuxedo. Her hand stopped on one of Leonard's shirts. What do you mean it showed you? Exactly what I said. Was it a reflection? Yes. Then how did it move first? I don't know. She set the shirt down and came into the bathroom. I followed her. The mirror showed both of us standing in the doorway. Beverly had one hand at her side. Her reflection had the same hand raised toward the glass. Beverly saw it. Her reflection lowered its hand. Beverly didn't move. She stepped backward and hit the door frame. The reflection stayed close to the mirror. For 1 second, it looked like the reflected version of her was standing in front of us instead of behind the glass. Then it turned normal. Beverly looked at me. She didn't ask if I was tired. She didn't ask if I'd been drinking. Those were the questions people asked when they wanted the explanation to be easy. Was that the same thing? She said. I think so. Think? It happened fast. She looked at the mirror again. Where did the tuxedo come from? Tim had one. I know. He wore it at Hartwell's. Beverly folded her arms. You said he was wearing a tuxedo when he disappeared? I hadn't told her that part. I told her the power had failed and Tim had gone upstairs. I didn't say that. No, you didn't. The house stayed quiet around us. The invitation was still on the kitchen counter. I could see its corner from the bedroom doorway. Beverly asked if the mirror had done anything else. I told her no. She asked if I had touched it. I said no. She asked if it happened only in the bathroom. I wasn't sure yet. We checked the other mirrors. The small one near the front door showed me in the tuxedo before I reached it. The glass over the dresser did the same thing when I crossed the bedroom. It didn't matter if I walked slowly or stopped without warning. Sometimes it only shifted its weight. Sometimes it turned its head. Once in the hallway, it lifted a hand toward the empty space beside it. Beverly didn't speak after that. She covered the hallway mirror with a blanket. Then she covered the dresser mirror and left the bathroom door shut. I helped her with the last one. The fabric hung loose over the glass and moved slightly whenever the heat came on. For the rest of the night, we avoided looking at anything that could reflect us. The dark television screen, the microwave door, the window over the sink after the kitchen lights were turned off. There were more mirrors in the house than I'd ever paid attention to. Most of them were small enough to ignore. The next morning, the invitation was still on the counter. Beverly picked it up while she made coffee. She read it again and held it out to me. You have to answer it. There's no address. There's an RSVP. There's nowhere to send it. Then call somebody. Who? She looked at the card. The handwriting was still Tim's. It hadn't blurred or changed overnight. "I don't know," she said. I kept the invitation on the counter for the next few days. I didn't mark yes or no. Beverly asked once if I was going to get rid of it. No. Why not? Because I don't know what happens if I do. She didn't argue with that. She put the card back beneath the salt shaker instead. The mirrors kept moving ahead of me. It became easier to notice when I wasn't looking directly at them. A change in the corner of the glass. A shoulder turning in the dark. A man in a black jacket standing where I'd been standing a moment before. I still worked. I paid the bills. Leonard's balance stayed at 0, and the mortgage was no longer behind. Angela stopped asking about Hartwell's. Beverly kept the house running the way she always had, though she stopped cleaning the bathroom mirror. One night, I stood in front of it with the light on. The reflection showed the same room, the same white sink, the same cabinet with the loose handle, the same man in the tuxedo waiting on the other side of the glass. I stayed still. The reflected groom faced the empty space beside him. I watched him wait there, beside the place where someone should have been, while the invitation remained unanswered on the kitchen counter. I always wanted to work in places where most people wouldn't go. The high desert, the deep shafts, the plateau country where the air was thin and the ground was honest. After 19 years of mine inspection work, I'd gotten pretty good at reading what the rock was trying to tell me. On Tuesday morning, 4 days after the collapse, I was alone at the Shaft 7 access mouth, doing the kind of assessment I could do in my sleep by that point. Core samples, displacement measurements, crack propagation mapping along the upper bore wall. The drill bit went into the rock. I watched the readout. I recorded the numbers in my field notebook. It was routine work, the kind that kept a mine running or told you when to shut it down. The context of where I was doing it, that was less routine. 4 days earlier, a detonation had collapsed the ventilation tunnel running parallel to the shaft. The mine authority in Santiago had authorized a partial evacuation the morning after. 9 buses and 4 company trucks had taken 200 of Cerro Yucai's 208 workers down the 40-kilometer unpaved access road toward Calama, the nearest city of any size, roughly 200 kilometers from the mine. I'd stayed behind with 7 others, a skeleton crew to keep the diesel generator compound running, maintain the bore integrity of Shaft 7, and wait for the repair crew that was supposed to arrive by helicopter within 48 hours. The repair crew had not arrived. The satellite phone had been showing one signal bar for 3 days without completing a single call. I didn't let that stop me from doing my job. I'd worked blast zones and flood risk bores and 3 separate structural failures in my career, and I understood that the Atacama Desert wasn't trying to kill me personally. It was simply a desert at 3,200 meters of elevation, with no water, no road cover, and a temperature swing of 40 degrees between noon and midnight. It would kill me as impersonally as it killed everything else if I stopped paying attention. So I paid attention. I recorded my readings in the field notebook with the same care I'd given every report for 19 years. The bore wall was stable. The cracking was within expected displacement parameters. The collapsed fill at the tunnel junction was dense and dry. These were good numbers. They told me the shaft mouth wasn't going anywhere. My sample drill struck metal at 1.2 meters of depth. I stopped and pulled the drill bit out, looking at the readout to make sure I'd read it correctly. Metal, not rock, not ore, not the rebar reinforcement from the tunnel supports. Those were mapped and I wasn't drilling anywhere near them. This was something else. I set down the drill and grabbed my short-handled excavation pick. I didn't assume it was anything. I just dug. The collapsed fill came away easily, dry and loose, and after about 20 minutes of careful work, I had exposed enough of the object to get my hands around it. I pulled it free and sat back on my heels, holding it. It was a steel document cylinder, about 35 centimeters long and 8 centimeters in diameter. the kind of waterproofed case used by military survey teams to transport field maps in conditions that would destroy paper. It was sealed with a rubber gasket that had compressed and dried but not failed. The exterior was pitted and stained with deep reddish mineral bleed, the specific iron sulfate discoloration that took decades to accumulate in this substrate. I recognized it immediately because I'd documented it on bore wall samples many times over the past 4 years. That staining didn't happen fast. It was the kind of thing that built up over a long time in the presence of groundwater and mineral leaching. I turned the cylinder in my hands, feeling the weight of it, and understood without needing to say it out loud that this had not been dropped here during the collapse 4 days ago. This had been in the shaft wall for a long time, possibly a very long time. I carried it back to the site office without opening it. The walk between the shaft mouth and the prefabricated operations building on the edge of the plateau took about 10 minutes. The midday heat was airless and flat, the kind of heat that didn't feel hot until you realized you'd stopped sweating. The desert in every direction was white salt pan and bare rock, running out to the horizon in a way that made distance hard to judge. I'd gotten used to it over 4 years. Most people didn't. The operations building was a long rectangular prefab with corrugated metal siding and 3 small windows. My office was at the far end, next to the equipment storage room. It wasn't much. A desk, a filing cabinet, a corkboard on the wall with the site maps pinned to it, and a single electric fan that ran off the generator compound. I stepped inside, closed the door behind me, and set the sealed cylinder on the desk. Then I turned on the fan. I opened the cylinder at my desk with the door closed and the single electric fan running because the room was airless and hot at midday. The rubber gasket had compressed and dried but not failed, and I worked it loose carefully, a little at a time, turning the cap counterclockwise until it came free in my hand. Inside, sealed in oilskin wrap, was a hand-drawn map of the Shaft 7 bore system. I spread it on the desk and began reading it against the engineering blueprints I had been working from for 4 years. The match was exact. The bore geometry was right. The service-level platforms at 200, 400, and 600 meters were all marked in their correct positions. The lateral drift tunnels at 350 and 580 meters were there, with their angles and dimensions noted in the margins. The processing cavern at 800 meters was drawn with the same proportions I had measured myself during my first month at Shadowpeople. The annotations were in Spanish in a careful hand, using measurement conventions and notation styles I recognized as consistent with Chilean state mining survey practice from the 1960s. I could date it that way, approximately, the same way I had dated the cylinder's mineral staining. Whoever had drawn this map had been working from the same standards I had learned in my training just 40 years earlier. I worked through the map systematically, cross-referencing each level against my own blueprints. Everything matched. The shaft diameter was correct to within a centimeter. The platform spacing was accurate. The drift tunnel orientations were exact. Whoever had made this map had been down in the shaft, or had worked from survey data that was more precise than anything I had seen in the official archive. Then I reached the bottom of the map. At a depth of 1,040 meters, 60 meters below the current shaft floor at 980 meters, there was a level marked and labeled. The label read, Nivel Cerro. I sat with the map for a long time. The fan turned. The room was hot. I read the label again. Nivel Cerro. Level 0. There was no level 0 in any blueprint, survey document, or operational record I had ever seen for Shaft 7 or for Cerro UK. The shaft floor was at 980 meters. That was the bottom. That was where the bore ended, where the processing equipment sat, where the ore hoists ran up to the surface. There was no level below it. But the map showed one. I leaned back in my chair and stared at it. The handwriting was neat and precise, the same hand that had annotated the rest of the map. This was not a mistake. This was not a smudge or a misplaced mark. Someone had drawn this level deliberately, at a specific depth with a specific label, Nivel Cerro, and they had buried the map in the shaft wall long enough for decades of iron sulfate staining to accumulate on the cylinder. I thought about the collapse 4 days earlier. I thought about the ventilation tunnel that had been sealed and the communications relay that had been destroyed. I thought about the satellite phone that had been showing one signal bar for 3 days without completing a single call. I thought about the repair crew that was supposed to arrive within 48 hours and had not arrived. Then I picked up my phone and photographed every centimeter of the map. I took close-ups of the annotations, the measurements, the label at the bottom. I took wide shots of the full-bore system. I took a photograph of the cylinder itself, with its mineral staining and its intact rubber gasket. When I was done, I had 47 photographs stored on my phone. I locked the cylinder in the bottom drawer of my desk, pockets my phone with the photographs, and walked out of the site office into the midday heat. I found Victoria outside the operations building, checking the fuel lines on the backup generator. She was crouched beside the housing with a wrench in one hand, her high-vis vest catching the late afternoon sun. When she heard my boots on the gravel, she looked up, and I could tell from her expression that she knew I had something to show her. I didn't say anything. I just pulled out my phone and handed it to her. She took it and scrolled through the photographs slowly. The hand-drawn map, the bore geometry, the annotations in Spanish, the label at 1,040 meters, Nivel Cerro. She didn't ask me where I'd found it or when. She just looked at each photograph twice, her thumb moving across the screen with the same careful precision she used when inspecting rope harnesses or checking pressure gauges. Then she handed the phone back to me and stood up. "Multiple workers reported vibration," she said. "Night shift, over the past 2 years, always from below the shaft floor." I waited. "Not seismic noise," she continued. "Not machinery resonance. Rhythmic, regular, low, felt through the boot soles and the handrails on the lower platforms." She paused, looking past me toward the plateau's edge where the sun was starting to sink. "I attributed it to volcanic substrate resonance. The Atacama sits on geothermal basement rock. Resonant cavities aren't uncommon." "But you didn't believe that," I said. She looked back at me. "I wrote it off," she said. "Multiple workers. Independently. Same description every time. I wrote it off." The way she said it made it clear she was admitting something she had known was wrong at the time but had chosen not to pursue. I understood that impulse. I had written off plenty of things myself over the years. Readings that were slightly outside parameters but not enough to halt operations. Structural anomalies that fell within acceptable tolerances. You make those calls because you have to keep the site running. You make them because the alternative is to shut everything down every time something feels wrong, and you can't do that. But this was different. "Did you hear it yourself?" I asked. She nodded once. 3 a.m, 600-meter platform. I was doing a routine safety inspection. I felt it through the handrail first, then through the floor. Regular interval, patient, like something breathing. She stopped there and didn't elaborate. I didn't press her. "We should compare the map against the original survey archive," I said, "in the morning." She agreed. We went back to our separate dormitory blocks as the sun set over the plateau, and I lay on my bunk in the dark, listening to the wind against the prefab walls and thinking about the hand-drawn map and the label at 1,040 meters. That night passed without incident. The next morning, Liam Kim did not show up for the 6 o'clock equipment check. Liam was 26, a drill operator from Antofagasta, the youngest member of the skeleton crew. He was the kind of person who slept through alarms and left things half done, but was good at his job when he showed up to do it. Victoria went to his dormitory block first, assuming he had overslept. She came back 15 minutes later and found me at the operations room terminal. "His bunk is empty," she said. "Made. Not slept in. Made with the kind of tidiness that looks wrong." I understood what she meant. A bunk made by someone who had gotten up deliberately, not someone who had rolled out of bed half asleep and pulled the blanket up as an afterthought. "His boots are gone," she added. "His phone is on the shelf." I pulled up the camp's motion sensor logs on the terminal. The system tracked every keycard entry and exit at the site's access gates, a security measure required by the mining authority after a contractor had died of exposure 3 years ago when he wandered off-site during a night shift and wasn't found for 2 days. Liam's keycard had been used at the Shaft 7 access gate at 2:18 in the morning. The gate had not been closed since. Victoria looked at the timestamp and then looked at me. "He's been down there for 4 hours, she said. We grabbed flashlights and rope harnesses from the equipment locker and descended the service ladder to the 200-meter platform. The ladder was steel mesh bolted to the shaft wall every 3 meters, with safety rungs every 10. It took us 20 minutes to reach the platform in the darkness, our flashlights cutting narrow beams through the still air of the bore. Liam was seated with his back against the rock wall, legs extended in front of him, eyes open. He was breathing, shallow but regular. His hands were in his lap. In his left hand, he was holding a small figurine, roughly 7 centimeters tall, carved from what appeared to be copper ore, shaped into a seated human form. His right hand was pressed flat against the rock wall beside him, palm down, as though he had leaned against it for balance and then stopped moving. Victoria called his name. He didn't respond. I crouched in front of him and checked his pupils with the flashlight beam, reactive, tracking the light as it moved across his face, but not fixing on anything in the room, not fixing on me. His eyes followed the beam, present but not conscious. His mouth was dry and clean, no chemical smell, no sediment, no signs of ingestion. Victoria reached down and lifted his right hand away from the wall to check his wrist for a pulse. She stopped. The rock behind his palm was warm, not the warmth of a hand that had been pressed against stone for hours, warm from inside, a dry, even heat radiating outward from the rock itself, from deeper in. I pressed my own palm flat against the same surface and felt it immediately. The kind of warmth that comes from something alive, something generating heat on the other side of a thin barrier. The rock was not conducting heat from Liam's hand, it was producing heat of its own. I pulled my hand away and looked at Victoria. She was still holding Liam's wrist, her fingers on his pulse point, her face unreadable in the flashlight's backscatter. "We need to get him to the surface," she said. We got Liam into a rope harness and hauled him up the service ladder 1 platform at a time, taking turns supporting his weight while the other climbed. He didn't resist. He didn't help. He moved when we moved him and stayed still when we stopped, his eyes open the entire time, tracking the motion of our flashlights, but never settling on either of our faces. At the surface, we laid him on a cot in the operations building, in the small side room we used for first aid and equipment storage. Victoria pulled off his boots to check his feet for injuries or swelling. She stopped again. The boot soles were worn through completely, the rubber abraded down to nothing, the sock beneath visible through the sole. Not worn thin over weeks of use, worn through, as though he had walked for days on abrasive rock without stopping. He had been gone for 4 hours. I looked at the figurine still resting in Liam's left hand. His fingers were curled loosely around it, not gripping, just holding. The copper had a dull sheen in the overhead light, and the surface was covered with engravings, radial lines extending from the figure's center outward, precise and deliberate. The same notational marks as the annotations on the hand-drawn map from the cylinder. I didn't say that out loud to Victoria. I didn't need to. She was looking at the figurine and then at me, and her expression told me she had already seen it. She had already made the connection. We stood on either side of Liam's cot in the operations building, the figurine with its radial line engravings resting in his open hand between us, neither of us speaking. The repair crew still had not arrived by Thursday morning. I stood in the operations room with the satellite phone in my hand, watching that single bar flicker on the display without connecting, and I made the decision that we could not wait anymore. Victoria was checking on Liam when I found her. He was still on the cot where we had left him, breathing shallow and regular, his eyes tracking something neither of us could see. The copper figurine we had taken from his hand was sitting on the desk beside him. I had locked it in a drawer twice. Both times I came back and found it sitting there in the open. I told Victoria we should drive to the highway junction, 40 kilometers down the access road where the convoy should have made the turnaround. There might be a mobile relay station left by the company or by emergency response teams. Someone should have scrambled by now. We needed to reach someone. She nodded without asking questions. We took water, the map cylinder, my notes. We left Liam breathing on the cot with the door to the operations building propped open so the air would move through. The utility truck started on the first try. That felt like a small mercy. We drove south on the unpaved access road with the sun climbing behind us and the salt pan white on both sides. The road was rutted and washboarded from years of heavy vehicle traffic, and the truck rattled over it at a pace that would have been faster if I had been willing to destroy the suspension. I was not. I kept it steady at 40 kilometers per hour and watched the dust plume rise in the rearview mirror. Victoria did not speak for the first 20 minutes. Then she said, very quietly, that she thought Liam had walked a long way while he was gone. The soles of his boots had been worn through completely, down to the sock. He had been gone for 4 hours. I said I knew. She asked if I thought the others from the convoy had walked back to the mine. I said I did not know. She went quiet again after that. We found the convoy at the 22-kilometer mark. I saw the first bus before I understood what I was seeing, just a shape on the road ahead, parked on the right shoulder. Then another behind it, then another. 9 buses and 4 company trucks, pulled off in a single line, evenly spaced, as neat and deliberate as a formation drill. I slowed the truck and stopped 30 meters back. Every door was open, every single one. I shut off the engine. The silence came in hard and immediate. No wind, no birds, just the faint ticking of the cooling engine and the flatness of the salt pan stretching away on both sides. Victoria got out without saying anything. I followed. The buses were company vehicles, the same type that ran the site rotations every 2 weeks, old Chilean manufactured coaches with high clearance for unpaved roads and bench seating for 25 people each. The paint was faded and dusty. The windows were closed. The doors hung open like mouths. I walked to the first bus and looked inside, luggage still in the overhead racks. A jacket draped over one of the seats. A water bottle in a cup holder, half full. A phone sitting in the seat cubby where someone had left it, screen dark. I walked the length of the convoy, checking each vehicle. All of them the same. Doors open, belongings left behind, no one inside. The handbrakes were set. The keys were still in the ignitions. The fuel gauges showed half tanks or better. Victoria was standing at the 4th bus, looking into the open luggage bay beneath the passenger compartment. Suitcases and duffel bags stacked neatly inside, untouched. She did not say anything. She did not need to. I kept walking. The road beyond the convoy was smooth and undisturbed. No footprints in the fine dust along the shoulder. No scuff marks, no dragged bags, no debris. Just the road running south toward the highway junction, empty and pale under the morning sun. I turned and looked at the desert on both sides. White salt pan, flat and unbroken, running to the horizon in every direction. 200 people had been on this convoy. There was nothing to show where they had gone. I walked back to the lead bus. The driver's logbook was sitting on the dashboard, open, a pen clipped to the top of the page. I recognized the format immediately. The same log system every company driver used, date and time in the left column, notes in the right. Fuel stops, rest breaks, anything worth recording. The last entry was dated 2 days after the evacuation. The timestamp read 23:47, 11:47 at night. The handwriting was steady and careful. The letters formed with the same blocky precision as every other entry on the page. It said, Nivel cero, escucho, volvemos. Nivel cero, I hear it. We are going back. I stood there with the logbook in my hands. The paper was slightly yellowed at the edges, dry from the desert air. The ink was dark and clean. I read the entry 3 times as though reading it again might change what it said. 200 people had gotten off these buses in the middle of the night, 22 kilometers from the mine, and walked back, not in panic, not scattered, together, deliberately. I put the logbook back on the dashboard exactly where I had found it and walked back to the truck. Victoria was already there, standing by the passenger door with her arms crossed. She looked at me and I looked at her, and I said we needed to go back to the camp right now. She got in without asking why. I drove faster on the return. The truck bounced hard over the washboard ruts and the suspension groaned, but I did not slow down. Victoria braced one hand on the ceiling grip and did not tell me to ease off. The dust plume behind us rose high and white, and we did not look back at it. When we reached the plateau, the dormitory blocks were empty. I checked Liam's cot first. He was gone. The figurine was gone from the desk. The door was still propped open how I had left it, but the room was empty and the air inside was hot and still. Victoria checked the other dormitories, moving quickly from room to room, calling names. No one answered. I already knew where they were. We found them at Shaft 7. All 6 of them, Liam and the 5 other skeleton crew members who had stayed behind when the convoy left, standing at the shaft mouth in a loose semicircle facing the open bore. Their eyes were open. They were breathing. They were perfectly still. Each one of them was holding a copper figurine in their cupped hands. Victoria walked up to the nearest one, a drill technician named Campos who I had worked with for 3 years. She stood directly in front of him and snapped her fingers in front of his face. He did not blink. He did not move. His chest rose and fell in shallow, regular breaths, and his eyes tracked nothing. I looked past them, toward the ground around the shaft mouth. There were figurines everywhere, not a handful, not a dozen, dozens, arranged on the ground in a wide arc around the bore opening, all of them upright. I started counting and stopped at 40. They were all identical, 7 centimeters tall, seated, copper, with the radial line engravings cut into their surfaces in the same pattern I had seen on the figurine Liam had been holding when we found him at the 200-meter platform. More than 6 people could have produced in 4 days, even if they worked continuously. Possibly more than 6 people could have produced at all, given the precision of the carving. I walked past the shaft mouth toward the generator compound. The generators were still running when I reached them. I could hear the low diesel thrum from 50 meters out, the sound I had been hearing as background noise since the day I arrived at Cherokee 4 years ago. But something about the sound was wrong, thinner. I got closer and understood why. Only one generator was running. Generator 1, the primary unit, was still on and functional. Generators 2 through 6 were silent. I checked the fuel lines. They had been disconnected, not torn, not cut, but carefully unthreaded at the coupling joints. The fuel from their tanks had been drained. I followed the dark stain on the ground and saw where it led. A shallow channel had been dug in the compacted earth, running from the generator compound in a straight line back toward Shaft 7. The diesel had been poured into the channel. It ran all the way to the shaft mouth, a thin, dark line across 50 meters of open ground, ending at the edge of the bore. Generator 1 had been left running deliberately. Someone had wanted the lights on in the dormitory blocks. Someone had wanted the ventilation blowers running in the upper shaft. I walked back toward the operations building. Victoria followed without speaking. The door to the operations room was open. I knew I had locked it before we left. I pushed it and stepped inside. The Shaft 7 blueprints had been pulled from the filing cabinet and spread across every table. Not stacked, not folded. Spread flat, edge to edge, covering every horizontal surface in the room. They had been annotated in pencil. Corrections to the bore geometry, revised depth measurements, adjustments to the drift tunnel angles that were more precise than anything I had ever recorded. At the bottom of every sheet, in the same handwriting, the same notation, 1,040 meters. Abierto ahora. 1,040 meters, open now. I walked slowly around the room, looking at each sheet. The handwriting was small and careful and maddeningly familiar. I had seen it somewhere before. On the convoy logbook, maybe, or on one of the skeleton crew's shift reports. I could not place it. The archive drawer at the back of the room had been forced. The lock was broken, the metal bent outward as though someone had pried it with a tool. Inside, the original 1967 survey notes were gone. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty drawer, and then I turned and walked back outside. Victoria was waiting at the shaft mouth. I walked past the 6 unresponsive crew members and joined her, and together we looked down at the figurines arranged on the ground. I counted them again, slowly, carefully. I counted them twice to be sure. There were 208. Chero Yukai employed 208 people. I looked at Victoria. She was already looking at me. Her face was pale and drawn, and her jaw was set. I knew that look. I had seen it 100 times over 4 years. The sun was high now, past noon, the light flat and white. The 6 crew members stood motionless at the bore, their hands cupped around their figurines, their eyes open and empty. The 208 copper figures sat in their arc around the shaft mouth, radial engravings facing outward, as precise and deliberate as the parked convoy on the road. Neither of us looked away from the other's face. I went back to my desk first to retrieve the map cylinder. The drawer where I'd locked it that morning slid open without resistance, and the cylinder was exactly where I'd left it. Steel, pitted with the deep mineral staining that had accumulated over decades. I carried it to the operations room and set it on the table beside the annotated blueprints that were still spread across every available surface. The hand-drawn map from the cylinder was older, rougher in its execution, but when I laid it over the annotated blueprints, the geometry matched perfectly. Every angle, every measurement. The penciled corrections on the blueprints were more precise than anything I had produced myself in 4 years at this site. They were more precise, even, than the original survey data. I stood there looking at them for a long time, trying to work out who had done the annotations. It had to be one of the 6 skeleton crew members during their unresponsive interval, but the handwriting was steady and deliberate and showed no signs of haste or confusion. Whoever had made these corrections knew exactly what they were doing. The locked archive drawer at the back of the operations room was hanging open when I turned around. The lock was broken, not forced from the outside, but broken from the inside. The metal bent outward as though someone had pried it open from within the drawer itself. That didn't make sense, but I didn't have time to think about it. Inside the drawer were the original survey notes from 1967. I read them standing there, one hand still on the open drawer. The notes described the anomaly at 1,040 meters as a resonant cavity of unknown origin in the volcanic basement rock. It was large enough to register as a significant density anomaly on the survey equipment, a void, roughly circular, approximately 60 meters in diameter. The survey crews at depth had reported auditory phenomena during the initial exploration, a rhythmic vibration perceived as intentional by multiple independent witnesses. The word intentional was underlined twice. The survey recommended permanent avoidance and recorded no further investigation. Shaft 7 was bored to stop at 980 meters, 60 meters short of the cavity. I could see the decision in the notes, written in a careful hand at the bottom of the page. Bore termination approved by site supervisor. No objections from survey team. They had known it was there. They had mapped it, noted its location, and then spent 60 years making sure no one went near it. I took the 1967 notes to the table and laid them beside the annotated blueprints. The fracture propagation data on the blueprints was clear. Cracks extending downward from the collapse point, through the shaft floor, continuing past 980 meters. The annotated blueprints showed the fracture network reaching Nivel Cerro in a branching pattern that looked almost deliberate, as though the collapse had known exactly where to propagate. The detonation 4 days ago had not merely sealed the ventilation tunnel. It had opened the chamber the 1967 survey had spent 6 decades avoiding. I traced the fracture lines with my finger, following them down to the void at 1,040 meters, and tried to imagine what it looked like now. A chamber that had been sealed for however long, thousands of years, possibly longer, suddenly exposed to air and light and whatever else had traveled down the shaft in the days since the blast. The workers who had gone missing, the convoy that had turned around, the skeleton crew standing motionless at the shaft mouth. All of them connected to Nivel Cerro. I turned my attention to the geological substrate map printed in the corner of the original hand-drawn document. The volcanic basement rock formation, the same rock type, the same resonant cavity substrate as Nivel Cerro, did not stop at the shaft. It ran outward from Cerro Yucay in a branching network, northeast, southwest, and west under the salt pan. A continuous seam of the same formation, threading under the desert like roots. I traced it northeast with my finger and found the Salar Blanco lithium facility, 28 kilometers across open salt pan. A different operation, a different company, but sitting directly over the same substrate. Salar Blanco had a permanent security post. I knew that from the regional safety briefings we'd attended last year. The post was equipped with a hardwired radio relay, a landline system physically separate from Cerro Yucay's communications infrastructure. If the hardwired relay at Salar Blanco was functional, we could raise Kalama. Victoria was standing in the doorway when I looked up. She had her arms crossed and she was looking at the 6 skeleton crew members through the operations room window, still visible in the distance, standing at the shaft mouth in the late afternoon light. The 1967 notes say it's a resonant cavity, I told her. Unknown origin. The survey crews heard something at depth and recommended permanent avoidance. Shaft 7 was supposed to stop at 980 meters. They made sure it never reached Nivel Cerro. And the blast opened it, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. She turned away from the window and looked at the map on the table. I pointed to Salar Blanco on the substrate map, explained about the hardwired relay, the landline system that might still be functional. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she nodded once. We can't take the truck, she said. The convoy on the road isn't an obstacle. It's a destination. 200 people walked away from those buses back toward the mine. If we drive, we'll end up the same way. She was right. I hadn't wanted to say it out loud, but she was correct. The access road led back to Shaft 7. Anyone who traveled it now was apparently redirected here, whether they wanted to be or not. We walk, I said. 28 kilometers across the salt pan, at night. The heat in daylight will kill us faster than the cold. Victoria went to the supply room and came back with 2 packs, 2 canteens, 2 headlamps. We filled the canteens from the water tank in the dormitory block, packed what food we could carry. Energy bars, trail mix, a few cans of soup we could eat cold if we needed to. I rolled the annotated blueprints and secured them with a rubber band, slid the map cylinder into my pack. Victoria took the 1967 survey notes and folded them into her jacket pocket. Before we left, I went back to the shaft mouth to check the skeleton crew one more time. All 6 were still standing in their loose semicircle, facing the open bore. Their eyes were open. Their hands were cupped in front of them, each one holding a copper figurine. I checked their pulses, all six steady, all six breathing in the same slow, even rhythm. We couldn't move them. Victoria and I were not strong enough to physically carry 6 unresponsive adults across 28 kilometers of salt flat, and even if we were, I didn't know if moving them would help. The convoy had been full of people who left their vehicles and walked back here on their own. Taking the skeleton crew away from the shaft might not keep them safe. It might just mean they'd walk back while we weren't looking. I left them where they were. The arc of figurines on the ground around the shaft mouth was still perfectly arranged, 208 of them, one for every person employed at Cerro Yucay. I counted them again, just to be sure. The number hadn't changed. Victoria was waiting for me at the edge of the plateau, her pack already on, her headlamp switched off to conserve the battery. The sun was setting behind us, turning the sky over the Andes a deep orange that would fade to black within the hour. The salt pan to the northeast was already gray with shadow. I took one last look at the 6 crew members standing motionless at the shaft mouth, the arc of figurines on the ground around them, and then Victoria and I turned northeast and began walking into the dark. We walked northeast across the salt flat. The temperature dropped fast after dark, 40 degrees between noon and midnight in the Atacama, and we moved at a steady pace, conserving water, not talking much. The salt pan stretched out white and flat in every direction. At 3,200 meters, the stars were very bright. I carried the map cylinder and the rolled blueprints. Victoria carried the water. An hour out from camp, the ground began to vibrate. Not the micro-seismic noise I'd learned to filter out over 4 years on this plateau. That was stochastic, irregular, a background texture you stopped noticing after a while. This was rhythmic, a slow, regular pulse rising through the salt flat and into the soles of my boots. The same interval every time, patient and even. Victoria felt it at the same moment I did. She grabbed my arm. We looked at each other and then down at the ground, as though we might see something. We didn't. The salt pan was smooth and undisturbed, white in the starlight. We walked faster. The vibration continued beneath us, steady and unhurried, neither increasing nor fading. I counted the interval between pulses and found it consistent. Maybe 6 seconds, maybe 7. I timed it against my own heartbeat for a few minutes and then stopped doing that. It was a bad idea. The rhythm was too close to a natural cadence, too easy to mistake for something organic. We walked for hours. Victoria didn't say anything about the vibration, and neither did I. There wasn't much to say. We both felt it. We both knew what it meant, or didn't mean, or might mean. Talking about it wouldn't change the fact that we had 13 more kilometers to cross, and that turning back would put us at the Cerro Yucay shaft mouth at dawn, which was not where either of us wanted to be. The salt pan stayed empty. The stars turned overhead. My legs kept moving. At the 15-kilometer mark in full dark, Victoria stopped. I stopped beside her and followed her gaze. There was a copper figurine sitting upright on the salt flat directly in front of her. Not half buried by wind, not lying on its side, upright, on bare salt, as though placed there. It was 7 centimeters tall, the same size as all the others. The same seated posture. The same radial engravings on its surface, visible in the starlight. There were no footprints around it. The salt pan in every direction was smooth and unbroken. Victoria crouched and picked it up. I said, "Put it down." She held it for a moment. The engravings caught the light. I could see her thumb tracing the lines on its surface, the same way I'd traced them on Liam's figurine back at the camp. Then she set it down on the salt flat, upright, in the same position she'd found it. We looked at each other. Her face was hard to read in the dark. I didn't know what mine looked like. Probably the same. We walked. The remaining 13 kilometers passed in silence. The vibration in the ground did not stop. The desert stayed empty. We didn't speak about the figurine or about what it meant that it was there, upright, with no tracks, at the exact midpoint of a route we'd decided to take only hours before. I thought about it, though. I thought about it the entire time. The figurine had been placed there, not dropped, not buried and exposed by wind, not kicked aside by an animal. Placed, upright, centered in our path, and there were no footprints, no boot marks in the salt, no disturbance in the crust, nothing to indicate that anyone had walked out to that spot and left it there. Which meant it had been there for a long time, long enough for the wind to smooth out any tracks, or it meant something else had put it there. I didn't let myself finish that thought. We kept walking. The stars turned. The vibration pulsed beneath us, steady and patient, and I tried not to think about how it felt like something waiting for us to arrive, waiting for us to understand. The concrete block outline of the Salar Blanco security post appeared against the pre-dawn sky ahead of us, a light on inside and a diesel generator running outside, and Victoria and I stopped walking for a moment and looked at it. The Salar Blanco security post was the kind of building you could miss if you weren't looking for it. A concrete block structure, maybe 4 meters by 6, with a corrugated metal roof and a diesel generator rattling outside. The light was on inside when we reached it at dawn. The door wasn't locked. I pushed it open and the hinges made a sound like a wounded animal. The security guard was at the desk. The roster posted beside the door said his name was Lopez, Dominic Lopez. He was seated upright in a metal folding chair, breathing, eyes open, looking at nothing. In each hand he held a copper figurine, the same size and shape as all the others, the radial engravings catching the light from the overhead bulb. I said his name. He didn't respond. Victoria moved past me into the room, checking his pulse at the wrist without trying to take the figurines from his hands. She looked at me and nodded once. Alive. The hardwired radio on the desk was on. The handset sat in its cradle with a strip of electrical tape holding the transmit button down, broadcasting a continuous carrier tone into the open frequency. The transmission counter on the unit showed 60 hours. I looked at that number for a long time. The Cerro Yucay collapse had been 4 days ago. Dominic Lopez had keyed that radio down before the collapse happened, before there was any reason to broadcast an emergency signal from this location, before anyone from Cerro Yucay could have walked 28 kilometers across the salt pan to reach this post. I pulled the tape off the handset and lifted it from the cradle. The carrier tone cut out and the frequency went quiet, just the faint hiss of static filling the silence. I keyed the transmit button. "This is Tony Gonzalez, Cerro Yucay Mine, calling Calama Mining Authority Dispatch. Does anyone copy?" I waited. The static continued. Then a voice came through, thin and controlled, the kind of voice that belongs to someone who has been awake for too many hours, managing a situation they don't fully understand.
This is Calama Dispatch. We copy. Go ahead.
I told him where we were. I told him we needed immediate assistance. I told him the hardwired relay at Salar Blanco was functional and that we could coordinate from this location. There was a pause on the other end. Then the dispatcher said, very carefully, that a regional emergency was active. Multiple mine sites across the Atacama had reported communication failure and missing workers. Cerro Yucay was not isolated. This was not one event. Victoria was spreading the geological substrate map on the desk beside the radio, smoothing it flat with her palms. I watched her trace the volcanic basement rock formation with her finger, starting from Nivel Cerro and moving outward under the salt pan, branching northeast, southwest, west. She traced it to Salar Blanco. She traced it to 4 other active mine sites marked on the map. She traced it all the way to Calama itself. The dispatcher was saying something about a geotechnical coordinator who had been briefed on the other sites, and that he was patching me through. The line clicked and went silent for a moment. Then a new voice came on.
This is Julian Valdez, Emergency Coordination. I'm listening. Go ahead.
His voice was measured and formal, the voice of someone used to synthesizing data from multiple sources and making decisions based on incomplete information. I told him about the figurines. I told him about the map from the cylinder, the 1967 survey, Nivel Cerro, the fracture propagation from the blast 4 days ago. I told him about the annotated blueprints in the operations room at Cerro Yucay, the corrections more precise than the original survey data, the notation at the bottom of every sheet reading 1,040 meters, open now. I told him about the convoy on the road, the logbook entry in the driver's handwriting that said, Nivel Cerro, I hear it, we're going back. I told him about the figurine on the salt flat 15 kilometers from the mine with no footprints around it. I told him there were 208 figurines at the shaft mouth and that 208 was the exact number of people who worked at Cerro Yucay. I told him all of it. Valdez listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end, just the faint hiss of the open frequency. Then he said,
Our working theory is mass hypoxia, volcanic outgassing from geothermal activity in the substrate, producing a hallucinogenic gas event across multiple sites simultaneously. It accounts for the behavioral symptoms we're seeing.
It's wrong, I said. Another pause. Then he said,
A military engineering team has already been scrambled to Cerro Yucay with a bore sealing kit. High-pressure expanding foam injection, the system used to seal mine voids after structural collapse. They can seal Shaft 7 from the surface down within hours of arrival.
I closed my eyes. I could see the bore geometry in my head, the lateral drift tunnels at 350 and 580 meters. That won't work, I said. The bore geometry of Shaft 7, specifically the lateral drift tunnels at 350 and 580 meters, will bleed pressure. The payload won't reach the shaft floor under sufficient pressure to seal a void 60 meters below it. The only way to seal Nivel Cerro is to drop the injection payload directly into the exposed chamber, which means sending someone down the shaft to 1,040 meters with the payload unit. I heard Victoria moving behind me. When I turned around, she had the operations harness from the security post's emergency kit in her hands, the standard rope descent equipment mounted on the wall beside the door, and she was putting it on with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it many times. I'll go, I said. She looked at me without stopping what she was doing. I'm the trained rope descent specialist on this site, she said. You're the engineer. The engineer stays on the radio and talks the rescue team in. She was correct. She had 3 years of rope descent certification, and I had none. The argument I wanted to make, that I should go because I couldn't stand to watch her go, wasn't an argument. It was a feeling, and feelings didn't change shaft geometry. I said nothing. Valdez was still on the line, saying something about deployment timelines and logistics. I told him we would be ready to coordinate when the team arrived. Then I gave him the radio frequency and the coordinates for the Salar Blanco post and told him I would remain here as surface coordinator. The line went quiet again. Then Valdez said,
Understood. The team will be on site within 4 hours. Stand by.
The frequency clicked off. Victoria finished buckling the harness and stood there for a moment, looking at the map on the desk. Then she looked at me. You stay on this radio, she said. You don't leave it for any reason. When they call in, you answer. Understood. Understood, I said. She nodded once, then turned and walked out the door into the dawn light. I stood there alone in the concrete room with Dominic Lopez seated at the desk behind me, breathing, eyes open, holding the figurines in his hands. The generator outside continued its low rattle. The overhead bulb flickered once and then steadied. I sat down at the desk and waited. The military team arrived at Cerro Yucay 4 hours later. The radio crackled to life and a new voice came on, clipped and professional, identifying himself as the team leader. I talked them through the bore geometry, the fracture propagation map, the the location of the lateral drift tunnels at 350 and 580 meters, the service platform positions at 200, 400, 600, and 800 meters. I told them what they would find at the shaft mouth. There was a long silence on the other end. Then the team leader came back on, his voice very quiet.
"We've counted them,"
he said. He didn't say how many. Victoria's voice came through the radio 20 minutes later. She was at the shaft mouth, suited up, the injection payload unit secured to her harness. The team was ready to begin descent. I confirmed the protocol with the team leader, talking him through the pressure monitoring equipment, the cable load indicators, the check-in intervals at each service platform. Then Victoria began her descent. She checked in at 200 meters. Her voice was steady and clear, and she noted, without elaboration, that the rock wall at the service platform was warm. Not the warmth of sun-heated stone, warm from inside. She checked in at 400 meters, at 600 meters. At 800 meters, her voice was still steady, and she said the vibration was stronger at depth, that she could feel it in the harness cable, that it wasn't unpleasant, and that she was continuing descent. Then the radio went silent. Not static, not interference. The same silence as the satellite phone back at Sero Yukai, the carrier signal present, the system functional, nothing coming through. I stood at the desk with the handset pressed to my ear and said her name into it. Victoria. Nothing. Victoria, do you copy? Nothing. I keyed the transmit button again and again, saying her name, and the silence on the other end was complete. The team leader came on. His voice was calm and professional, and he said the descent cable was still under load. She was still on it, still at depth. The cable hadn't gone slack. He said they were waiting. I told him to maintain position and keep monitoring the cable. Then I put the handset down on the desk and pressed my palms flat against the concrete surface and tried to breathe. 40 minutes passed. I counted them on the wall clock above the desk, watching the second hand move in its slow circle, each rotation taking longer than the last. Then the team leader came back on the radio. Surface monitoring equipment at the shaft mouth had registered a pressure change at depth, a pressure spike at the 1,040 meter mark, consistent with the injection payload deploying, followed by rapid pressure equalization as the expanding foam filled the void. I felt it through my boot soles before he said it. The vibration in the salt flat, the low, rhythmic pulse that had been rising through the concrete floor of the security post for the last 4 hours, stopped. It didn't fade gradually. It stopped all at once. The team leader came back on.
"The void is sealed,"
he said. There was a pause. Then he said very quietly,
"The cable is slack."
I stood at the desk in the Salar Blanco security post with the handset pressed to my ear, and the silence of the open frequency filling the room, the vibration gone from the floor beneath me, and I did not put the handset down. The helicopter came for me on Friday afternoon. I was still standing at the desk in the Salar Blanco security post with the radio handset in my hand when I heard the rotors. The military team leader had told me to wait there, that they were sending transport. I put the handset down and walked outside into the sun. The pilot didn't say much during the flight back to Sero Yukai. I sat in the back seat with my pack between my feet and watched the salt flat pass below us, white and flat and empty all the way to the horizon. From the air you could see the line we'd walked, 2 sets of boot prints cutting northeast across the pan, dark against the white. Just ours, no one else's. When we reached the mine, the helicopter circled once before landing. I could see the shaft mouth from above. The military team had set up a perimeter around it with orange cones and caution tape, the kind you see at road construction sites. The skeleton crew members were gone, loaded into a medical transport truck, the team leader told me later. The figurines were still there. I counted them from the air. 208, arranged in a perfect semicircle. They landed the helicopter on the plateau near the dormitory blocks, and I got out. The team leader met me there. His name was Vargas. He was maybe 50, with gray hair, and the kind of face that doesn't give anything away. We searched for 6 hours, he said. Camera equipment, the whole shaft. We went as deep as we could before the wall integrity became unsafe. I nodded. I already knew what he was going to say. We didn't find her, Vargas said. The descent cable was intact. No signs of breakage or failure. It was just unclipped. I looked past him toward the shaft mouth. The caution tape was fluttering in the wind. The report will say that, Vargas continued, that the cable was unclipped. We don't know how, we don't know why, but that's what the evidence shows. I didn't ask if they were going to keep looking. I could see it in his face that they weren't. Thank you, I said, because I didn't know what else to say. Vargas nodded and walked back toward the perimeter. I stood there for a while, looking at the shaft mouth, and then I went to the dormitory block to collect my things. Over the next week, they recovered the workers. All of them. 200 people from the convoy on the road, the 6 skeleton crew members from the shaft mouth, workers from the other affected mine sites across the Atacama, all alive, all presenting the same unresponsive state, breathing, eyes open, not responding to their names or to being touched. They loaded them into medical transports and took them to hospitals in Calama and Antofagasta and Copiapó. I was in Santiago by then, staying in a hotel near the mining authority's central office while they debriefed me. The debrief took 3 days. Different people asking the same questions in different ways. What did you see? What did you hear? What did the map show? What did the figurines look like? How many were there? When did the vibration start? When did it stop? I answered everything. I showed them the photographs on my phone. I gave them the map cylinder and the annotated blueprints. I told them about the 1967 survey and the resonant cavity at 140 meters and the fracture propagation from the collapse. I told them about the convoy logbook and what it said. I told them about the figurine on the salt flat with no footprints around it. They listened. They took notes. They didn't tell me what they thought any of it meant. On the 5th day after the extraction, I got a call from the hospital in Antofagasta. They told me Liam Kim had woken up. They said he was asking for someone from Cerro Yucay. I told them I'd come. I drove up the next morning. It took 6 hours. The hospital was a concrete block building on the south side of the city, near the port. I found Liam in a recovery ward on the 3rd floor. He was sitting up in bed with a nurse taking his blood pressure. The first thing he said when he saw me was, "I need to give it back." The nurse looked at me. I looked at Liam. "Give what back?" I asked. Liam looked down at his hands. They were empty. He stared at them for a long time, turning them over, looking at his palms, and then the backs of his hands. "I don't know," he said finally. He didn't say anything else. I stayed for another 20 minutes, but he just kept looking at his hands. The nurse told me he'd been like that since he woke up. Confused, disoriented, asking for something he couldn't name. She said the doctors thought it would pass. I drove back to Santiago that afternoon. On the way, I listened to the radio. There was a news report about the mine closures. Multiple sites across the Atacama shut down permanently due to structural failures. They didn't mention Cerro Yucay by name. They didn't mention the workers or the figurines or anything about what had actually happened. Just structural failures. Routine safety measures. Nothing to worry about. The military team cataloged the figurines. Vargas sent me the report a week later. 208 at the shaft mouth, like I'd counted, and another 1,400 recovered from below. From the service platforms at 200 and 400 and 600 meters, from the drift tunnels, from the processing cavern, all the way down to the collapsed shaft floor at 980 meters, arranged in layers, the report said, descending layers, all of them upright, all of them identical, all of them placed with the same precision as the one we'd found on the salt flat. The catalog ran to 11 pages. I read it twice. Then I filed it away and didn't look at it again. Cherryukai was closed permanently. The official reason given was structural integrity failure following the detonation collapse. Nobody questioned it. The other affected sites were closed for the same reason. The workers were released from the hospitals after psychiatric observation and sent home. The diagnosis was dissociative episode consistent with acute hypoxic hallucination, mass hysteria brought on by volcanic outgassing. It was a coherent explanation. It accounted for everything in a way that didn't require anyone to believe something they couldn't explain. I was offered a desk job at the mining authority's central office in Santiago. Environmental compliance reports, reading applications, cross-referencing data, writing summaries. I accepted it without asking any questions. My supervisor didn't ask why I wasn't going back to field work. Maybe he already knew. Maybe Vargas had told him something, or maybe he'd just read the debrief transcripts and put it together himself. Either way, he didn't bring it up. The work was easier than I expected. I'd thought sitting at a desk all day would feel like a kind of death after 19 years in the field, but it didn't. The office was quiet. The reports were clear and straightforward. The numbers added up or they didn't. Nobody's life depended on whether I caught an error in the third column of page 7. The silence, which I'd always thought of as a deprivation, felt like something I needed now. I read compliance reports. I checked data against regulatory standards. I signed off on environmental impact assessments. Outside my office window, the city went about its afternoon. Cars in the street, people on the sidewalks, the low hum of Santiago in the middle of a weekday. Inside, the office stayed quiet around me. I didn't think about the shaft. I didn't think about the figurines or the map or the vibration in the salt flat. I didn't think about Victoria descending into the dark with the injection payload, or the radio going silent, or the way the team leader's voice had sounded when he told me the cable was slack. I just read the reports, one after another, page by page. The numbers said the operations were compliant, or they weren't. I trusted the numbers. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, 14 months after Cherryukai closed. I was at my desk in the mining authority's central office in Santiago, reviewing environmental compliance reports for lithium extraction sites in the second region, when the mail clerk dropped it in my inbox. It was padded, the kind used for sending documents you don't want creased, and it had been postmarked from Calama. There was no return address. I set it aside and finished the paragraph I was reading. The report detailed groundwater contamination levels at a brine pool operation near the Salar de Atacama. The numbers were within acceptable limits. I signed off on it and moved to the next one in the stack. The envelope sat there for maybe 20 minutes before I opened it. Inside was a copper figurine, 7 centimeters tall, seated, with radial lines engraved across its surface, and a folded sheet of paper. I knew what the figurine was the moment I saw it. I had counted 208 of them arranged in a semicircle around the mouth of Shaft 7, and I had held one in my hand at the Salar Blanco security post, while Victoria descended into the dark with the injection payload unit. I had not expected to see another one. I had not expected anything from Cherryukai to follow me here. I unfolded the paper. It was a geological substrate map, newer than the one I had pulled from the cylinder at the shaft mouth, produced with modern survey equipment, the kind that gives you precision down to the meter. The contour lines were clean and exact in a way the 1967 document had never been. It showed the volcanic basement rock formation extending far beyond any existing geological chart I had ever seen, north under the Bolivian Altiplano, east into Argentina, west toward the Pacific coast. New sections of the formation were circled in red. Each circle had a depth measurement written beside it in a careful hand, followed by a question mark. The circles were spread across hundreds of kilometers of substrate. I counted them twice. There were 11. The handwriting on the annotations was familiar. I had been looking at it for weeks during the investigation, on the corrected blueprint spread across the operations room table at Shadowpeople, at the bottom of every sheet in the same neat script. The words that had been written there, over and over. 1,040 meters. Open now. I had assumed it belonged to one of the skeleton crew members during their unresponsive interval. Maybe Liam, or one of the others who had stood at the shaft mouth with copper figurines cupped in their hands. I had never matched it to a specific person because the handwriting analysis had not been a priority for the investigators. They had been focused on the geological survey data, on the mass hypoxia theory, on the structural integrity failure that had given them a reason to close the mine and move on. I recognized it now. I had been reading my own handwriting for 42 years. I sat at my desk with the map in front of me and the figurine beside it and did not move for a long time. Outside the window, Santiago went about its afternoon. The traffic noise from the street below was a low hum, steady and ordinary. Inside, in the silence of my cubicle, I became aware of something I had not noticed before. Or maybe I had noticed it and dismissed it. A sensation in the soles of my feet, faint, regular, rising up through the building's concrete foundation. Patient. Even. The same interval I had counted on the salt flat, standing in the dark with Victoria beside me and the copper figurine upright on the smooth white salt with no footprints around it. I sat very still and felt it. One pulse, then another, the same rhythm, the same patient, deliberate spacing. It was not the stochastic noise of traffic or construction or the building settling. It was not random. It was intentional. It had been there the whole time. I looked at the map spread open in front of me. 11 circled sites, each one marked with a depth measurement and a question mark, each one waiting. I looked at the copper figurine beside it, the radial lines engraved across its surface catching the fluorescent light from the ceiling. I looked at my own handwriting. The vibration rose through the concrete floor into the soles of my feet, patient, even, waiting for me to stop explaining it away. I was topping off the lantern at the north window when the first light started coming up behind the fog. It wasn't much light. Marrow Hollow doesn't get much before dawn, especially in December. But the sky had gone from black to a dirty gray, and I could see the last fence post down by the north road. The fog was pressed against the glass so hard it looked solid, like somebody had packed the whole window with wet cotton. The house smelled like oil and cold ashes. Outside it smelled worse. Wet ash mixed with something sweet and rotten. I didn't know what made a smell like that, and I didn't want to find out. My hands were cracked across the knuckles. They'd been that way for years. 30 years of damp cold will do that to you. The skin splits and heals and splits again, and after a while you stop noticing unless the oil gets into the cuts. I unscrewed the cap on the lantern and poured the last of the oil in. The lantern flame had gotten low. That was why I was up. If it went out before morning, I didn't know how long the house would stay safe. Nobody knew exactly how long. The rules didn't say. They just said to keep a lantern burning at night. I looked through the glass while I tightened the cap. The last fence post was still there. Beyond it stood one of the tall, thin figures. I didn't look right at it. You learn not to stare at things like that. I could see enough without looking. Long shape, pale arms hanging down, head bent a little, like it was listening for something on the other side of the fence. I turned the wick up and watched the flame grow. In the adjoining room, Isabella was asleep behind her smaller window lamp. I could see the yellow light through the gap in the doorway. Her coat was hanging from the chair beside the bed. She'd kicked one of the blankets down onto the floor, which was something she did most nights, even though she was always cold when she woke up. I checked the smaller lamp anyway. It was still burning. The clocks in town didn't agree with each other. They hadn't for as long as I could remember. The one in our kitchen said a little after 3. The clock at Kinsley's said something closer to 5. At least it had the last time I saw it. Orion kept one that had stopped at 11:17 and never moved again. None of them were right. There wasn't a dog in Marrow Hollow that barked anymore either. We still had dogs, or at least people had dogs, but they didn't make a sound. They'd look toward the fog and stand there with their ears up. Sometimes they'd whine. I carried the empty oil can away from the window and set it on the table. There were 2 rules everybody followed. Keep a lantern lit at night to hold the reachers away. Never let the fog enter your body. That's what people said anyway. The rules had been passed down since the fog came in from the North Road in December of 1988. Nobody knew who'd made them up. Nobody knew if they were rules in the way a law was a rule, or just something somebody tried once and kept doing because it seemed to help. Nobody knew what the fog was. Nobody knew where it ended. Kinsley had stopped answering people when they talked to her. At first I figured she was just being stubborn. Kinsley could be stubborn. She'd been that way for as long as I'd known her, and there wasn't much use in taking it personally. Then she stopped turning around. Every day she'd sit at her north window and face the glass. If somebody knocked, she wouldn't answer. If somebody waved from the road, she wouldn't wave back. She just stayed there looking toward the fence. I'd seen it happen before. People started losing things first. Names, faces, words. Then they stopped acting like anybody was home inside them. I was carrying the fresh lantern from the shelf when I heard Orion calling from down the road. "Ronnie." I looked toward Isabella's room. She hadn't woken up. "Ronnie, get over here." Orion's voice came from Kinsley's house, 2 doors down. He didn't shout often. When he did, I listened. I left Isabella asleep behind her lit lamp and went outside with the lantern in my hand. The cold got through my coat right away. It wasn't a sharp cold. It was damp and heavy, the kind that worked into your sleeves and settled against your skin. The fog covered the road from one side to the other. I could see Orion's lantern ahead of me and the dark shape of Kinsley's house behind it. He was standing in the front doorway. "She changed overnight," he said when I came up. "What happened?" "Come look." I followed him inside. Kinsley was sitting upright in the chair beside her north window. Her eyes were open. She was looking through the glass, not at us. Gray vapor leaked from the corners of her mouth. It wasn't smoke. It moved too slowly for smoke, and it hung around her face before the room took it. Every few seconds her lips moved. She shaped words with them. I couldn't hear anything. I stepped closer. "Kinsley?" She didn't look at me. Her mouth kept moving. Orion stood beside the door with his lantern held out. The light made Kinsley's face look thin and washed out. She didn't seem afraid. She didn't seem like she knew we were there. "Kinsley," I said again. Nothing. She pushed herself up from the chair. I reached for her, but Orion caught my arm. Kinsley walked toward the front door. "Orion, let go." Once they turn toward the fence, you can't stop them. His fingers tightened around my sleeve. "If she reaches the fog, the reachers will use her to come closer." Kinsley opened the door. The gray air came in around her. I pulled free of Orion and went after her. She was already halfway down the walk. Her slippers made a soft scraping sound against the wet boards, and then the gravel. Orion moved ahead of me and stepped into her path. "Kinsley, stop." She walked around him. He moved in front of her again. She walked around him again. It wasn't that she refused to listen. Refusing meant she had heard you. Kinsley didn't seem to hear anything. The vapor kept slipping from her mouth. Her lips moved like she was trying to remember a sentence. We followed her onto the north road. The last fence post stood ahead in the gray. I could see the figure beyond it now, and another one farther down the fence line. They were still. All of them were still. I kept my eyes on Kinsley. "Kinsley, come back," I said. Listen to me. Come back inside." She didn't slow down. Orion got in front of her one more time. She walked straight toward him until he had to step aside. He reached for her shoulder but stopped before touching her. Kinsley crossed the road and stepped past the last fence post. The fog opened. A pale, jointed arm unfolded from the gray. It came out too far and bent in the middle where no arm ought to bend. It wrapped around Kinsley's body and pulled her forward. She didn't cry out. The fog closed over her. Orion grabbed my coat, but I was already standing still. There was nothing to chase, nothing to fight. Just wet gravel and the 2 small slippers she'd left behind. It took me the rest of the day to get back from Kinsley's house. The road wasn't far, but I stopped more than once. I kept thinking I heard something behind me. Every time I turned around, there was only the fog and the fence, and the 2 slippers sitting in the gravel where Kinsley had left them. Orion walked with me as far as my house. He didn't say much on the way back. There wasn't much to say. We'd both seen what happened. At my door, he stopped and looked at the lantern in my hand. "Keep it burning," he said. "I know."
"Ronnie, listen. They all start the same way."
I looked at him. "Names first, then faces, then speech." He'd told me that before, but I'd never heard him say it like that. Not as a rule, as something he'd watched happen more than once. "Kinsley forgot us?" I asked. She was already forgetting. "She knew me this morning." "Maybe she did." He said it plain, like that made it easier. It didn't. I went inside and closed the door behind me. The house was colder than I'd left it. The north window lamp had burned down while I was gone, and the flame was barely more than a blue point at the top of the wick. I turned it up. The flame jumped and filled the glass. I poured in more oil from the can on the table and tightened the cap. My hands were still wet from the fog. The oil got into the cuts across my knuckles and made them sting. Isabella was sitting on her bed with her mother's old coat wrapped around her. She'd pulled the sleeves over her hands. The room was dark except for the small lamp beside the window. She looked at me when I came in. "Dad? I'm here. Where did you go?" "I went to see Kinsley." She thought about that. Her face didn't change much, but she looked down at the blanket. "Is she sick?" I didn't answer right away. Orion had said the ones who were ready got taken. I didn't know if Kinsley had been ready. I didn't know what ready meant. Maybe it meant empty. Maybe it meant there wasn't enough left inside her for the reachers to take. "She went out to the fence," I said. "Why?" "I don't know." That wasn't exactly true. I knew why. I just didn't know how to explain it to an 8-year-old. The fog had gotten into her somehow. It had pulled the names out of her, and then the rest of her had followed. I sat down beside Isabella and took the photograph from the small table near her bed. It was one of the few pictures we had left. Sierra was standing in front of the house with one hand resting on Isabella's shoulder. Isabella was little in the picture, maybe 4. Sierra had her hair pulled back and she was smiling at the camera. I held it out. "Who is this?" Isabella looked at the photograph. "That's Mama." "What's her name?" She looked at me again. "Mama. Her other name." Isabella rubbed one of her fingers along the edge of the blanket. She stared at the picture for a long time. "Sierra," she said finally. It came out soft, like she wasn't sure the word belonged there. "That's right." She kept looking at the picture. "What did she look like?" Isabella frowned. "She had brown hair," she said. "She did. And blue eyes." "That's right." Isabella leaned closer to the photograph. The lamp beside her made a yellow spot on the glass. "I don't remember her face." I didn't say anything. The woman in the picture was smiling. I could see the little crease beside her mouth and the way one side of her hair had come loose near her ear. I knew that face better than I knew my own. I'd watched it sleep. I'd watched it get angry with me. I'd watched it disappear into the fog 3 years earlier. "Isabella," I said. She handed the picture back. "Can I go to sleep?" "Not yet." She looked tired. I was tired too, but I didn't want to let her sleep. I had the feeling that if she went to sleep, she might wake up with something else gone. The cat came in through the crack beneath the door. It was a gray thing with a white patch under its chin. It rubbed against Isabella's ankle and climbed onto the bed. Isabella looked down at it. "Come here, Sierra." The cat stopped. I felt something inside me go cold. "That's not Sierra." Isabella picked up the cat. It settled against her chest and started to purr. "What is it?" "It's the cat." "I know. What's its name?" She looked at me. The question seemed to trouble her. She looked down at the cat's face and then toward the door as if somebody else might be standing there with the answer. "It has a name," I said. Isabella shook her head. "What is it?" "I don't know." She said it without crying. I reached over and took the cat from her. It twisted once in my hands and jumped to the floor. Then it walked beneath the bed and disappeared into the dark. Isabella watched it go. "What was I calling it?" I didn't answer. I sat beside her until the lamp flame started to flutter. The room smelled like cold cloth and oil. Outside the window, the fog pressed against the glass. It moved in slow folds, though there wasn't any wind I could feel inside. 3 years earlier, Sierra had gone north the same way Kinsley had. It had been morning then. The road was wet, and the fog had covered the fence line. Sierra put on her coat and told me she'd be back before morning. She'd said it softly, like she didn't want to wake Isabella. I told her not to go. She went anyway. I followed her as far as the last fence post. I could have grabbed her. I could have pulled her back. I didn't. The rules said the fog took people who crossed the fence. The rules said the lanterns kept the house safe. There wasn't anything else. No help coming. No road out. I watched Sierra walk into the gray. Her shoes stayed behind in the wet gravel. I told myself I'd done what I could. The fence was there for a reason. If the rules were all we had, breaking them would only get more people killed. I'd been telling myself that for 3 years. Isabella leaned against my arm. "Dad?" "Yeah." "Do you remember Mama's face?" I looked at the photograph in my hand. "Yes." She nodded. But I didn't think she believed me. Maybe she was trying to hold on to the answer. Maybe she already knew there were some things I couldn't keep for her. I got up and went to the front room. At the north window, the lantern had brightened. I checked the wick and turned it down a little. Too much flame used too much oil, and I didn't know how much we had left. The second can was in the cupboard beneath the sink. I took it out and set it beside the door. I wasn't going to sit beside Isabella and watch her lose everything the way I had watched Kinsley. The fog had come from the North Road in 1988. Everybody knew that. It had started there and spread through town, but nobody had ever gone beyond the fence to see where it began. Nobody had ever come back from trying. I didn't know what was out there. I didn't know if there was a source or a cause or just more fog stretching past the road forever. But if it had come from somewhere, then somewhere was where I needed to go. The rule said, never cross the fence. I had followed that rule while Sierra walked away. I had followed it while Kinsley went into the gray. I wasn't following it again. I took the oil lantern from the north window and checked the fuel. It was full enough. I set it by the door and picked up the second container. Then I went to Isabella's room and took her mother's old coat from the chair. Isabella was still awake. I held the coat out to her. "Put this on." "Are we going somewhere?" "I'm going somewhere." "Where?" I looked at her for a second. "I'm going to find a way to stop the fog. I'll be back before you have to sleep." She didn't ask how. She just looked at the coat. "Will you take me?" "No." "Dad?" Listen, you stay inside. Keep the lamp burning." She nodded. I wanted to tell her I wasn't going far. I wanted to tell her the fence was close, and I'd be back before the sky changed. I didn't tell her those things because they weren't true, or because I didn't know if they were true. She put on the coat. It hung down past her knees. I carried the lantern to the front door and set it beside the fuel. Isabella's coat was next to it, ready to be pulled on when the cold came through. I stood there before dawn with the lantern, the fuel, and Isabella's coat beside the door. I was reaching for the door when somebody came out of the fog. At first I thought it was one of the reachers. The shape was too tall and too dark around the edges, and there wasn't any sound of footsteps on the road. Then the figure came closer, and I saw a woman wearing a bright yellow jacket. She stopped a few yards away from the porch. The jacket was the sort of thing you could see from half a mile off. It had blue strips on the sleeves and a black zipper down the front. Her pants were dark and tight around the legs, and her boots looked too clean for Marrow Hollow. She carried something in one hand that gave off a pale blue light. She looked at me. "Hi," she said. Her voice was clear and young. "Can you tell me where Cedar Loop is?" I had no idea what Cedar Loop was. "Don't come any closer." She looked behind herself at the fog. Then she looked back at me. "Okay, I won't." She didn't sound like she was listening. She sounded like somebody trying to stay calm while deciding whether the other person was dangerous. I held the lantern out in front of me. The light reached her jacket and made it shine. There was no wetness on her, no gray vapor coming out of her mouth. Her hair was dry too, and her face had color in it. She looked warm. "Listen," I said. "You need to turn around and go back into the fog." "Back where?" "Wherever you came from." "I came from a hiking trail." There wasn't a hiking trail north of Marrow Hollow. There was the road, the fence, and the fog. That was all there had been for 30 years. She lifted the thing in her hand and pressed her thumb against it. The screen lit up brighter. She tapped it twice and held it up near her face. "There's no signal," she said. "I told you to go back." "Okay, but I don't know where back is. I got turned around about 20 minutes ago. I was on a marked trail and then the fog came in, and now I'm standing in a road talking to a guy carrying an oil lamp." She looked at the lantern when she said that. She didn't seem to know what to make of it. "What's your name?" I asked. She hesitated. "Brooke." I nodded. "I'm Ronnie." She gave a quick nod back. "Ronnie, where is Cedar Loop?" "I don't know." "It's on the map." She checked the phone again. I had no word for it then, but I knew it was some kind of little glass screen. There weren't any buttons except one on the side. It shone against her fingers without any flame or oil. Brooke tapped the screen again. "Still nothing," she said. "You need to leave the road." "Which way?" "South." She turned and looked down the road in the direction I pointed. The fog was thick there. The houses sat along both sides of it with their window lamps burning, though she didn't seem to see them. She looked past them like there was something farther away. "The sun's out that way," she said. "It isn't. It is where I came from. There's no sun tonight. It's not night." I didn't answer her. I looked at the sky above the road. It was the same dirty gray it had been every morning since the fog came. The light never got any brighter. The morning never moved on to day. Brooke took a step toward me. "Look, I don't know what's going on here. I just need a road out." "Don't come closer." She stopped again. The phone hung at her side. "You keep saying that." "Because you keep coming closer." "I was trying to get around you." She moved to her left. I moved the same way without thinking. The lantern swung between us and threw our shadows across the wet gravel. Her shadow went with her. Mine didn't. I looked down at my boots. They were standing in the gravel, but there wasn't a clear mark under them. The stones looked wet and dark between my feet. I could see the lantern's light on the road, but I couldn't feel any heat coming off it. The metal handle was cold in my hand. Brooke moved around me again. This time she came close enough that I could see the green in her eyes. She looked at my face and then at my shoulder. Her expression changed. She stepped forward. Her arm passed through the edge of my coat. It wasn't like touching somebody. There was no pressure, no cloth brushing cloth. For a second I could see the fog through the place where her sleeve crossed me, and then she jerked back with a sharp breath. "What the hell?" I looked at my coat. It was still there. My arm was still inside it. "Don't," I said. "I didn't touch you. You nearly walked through me." "I did not." She raised both hands. The phone was still in one of them. Her face had gone pale. "Okay, I'm sorry. I was trying to get around you." "You can't go that way." "I can't go any way. You just told me to go south, but you won't let me pass. Because you need to stay away from the houses." She looked past me again. This time she stared longer. Behind her I could see the road leading north, the row of homes, the fences, and the small lamps burning in every window. She saw something else. "There aren't any houses." "They're right there. Ronnie, I can see the road." I turned and pointed toward the nearest one. "That house, the one with the blue door." She didn't move. "There's a foundation." "What?" "There's a burned foundation where you're pointing." I looked at the house. The blue door was shut. Smoke stains ran up the siding beside the windows, though I didn't remember them being there before. The roof was whole. The porch boards were wet beneath the lantern light. "That's a house. It's rubble." She took another step back. The fog curled around the road behind her, but it didn't touch her boots. I looked at her jacket again. It was bright and smooth, made from some kind of thin material that didn't look like wool or canvas. She had a small pack on her back and a bottle clipped to one strap. The things she wore belonged somewhere else. They looked too new for a town where people patch the same coats year after year. "How did you get here?" I asked. "I told you I was hiking." "Hiking where?" "On Cedar Loop." "I don't know that place." "There's a trail map right here." She held the phone toward me. The screen showed lines and little colored marks. One of the lines made a loop around a green shape. Another line ran beside it. At the top were words I could read but didn't understand. Cedar Loop. The letters were sharp and small. They didn't look printed with ink. They seemed to be sitting inside the glass. "That's not a map," I said. "Yes, it is. No map is that size." She looked at the phone. "It's my phone." "I don't know what that means." She let out a breath through her nose. It wasn't quite a laugh. "Right. Okay. You're either messing with me or you're not from around here." "I live here." "Where?" I pointed at the house behind me. "There." She looked over my shoulder. Isabella's window lamp was burning in the room beyond the front wall. The yellow light showed through the curtains. Brooke's eyes narrowed. "There isn't a house there either." "Isabella's inside." "Who?" "My daughter." She stared at me like she'd heard something that made no sense. "Ronnie, there is no house. There are burned foundations all along this road. Trees are growing through some of them. The houses are right there. The town burned down." I felt a twinge of anger then. Not much, just enough to make my hand tighten around the lantern. "Marrow Hollow is still here." She shook her head. "Marrow Hollow burned to the ground in 1988. There were no survivors." The road went quiet after she said it. I could hear the fog moving against the fence. Somewhere behind me a clock ticked twice and stopped. The houses stayed where they were. The lamps stayed lit. The road continued into the gray. "What year did you say?" I asked. 1988. No, you said there were no survivors. That's what I said. How do you know? Because it's on the trail information, and because everybody knows about it. She held the phone out again and tapped the screen. A different picture appeared. There were more words, a small photograph, and a date near the top. October 5th, 2024. I knew the numbers, but not the way they were arranged. The date sat above a picture of dark trees and a blue sky. There was sunlight in the picture. Real sunlight. It was yellow and strong across the trail. It's 2024, she said. This is the date. I looked from the screen to her face. That can't be right. Why not? Because the fog came in 1988. Yeah, that's what I'm telling you. No, it came in December. I remember it. So do I. I mean, not personally. I wasn't alive then. She stopped and looked at me. Wait, how old are you? 30. She looked at the phone again. Her lips parted a little. 30? Yes. That would make you born in 1994. I was born before the fog. She lowered the phone. Ronnie, I don't know what you are. I just told you. No, you told me your name. She looked at the road by my boots. Her shadow stretched across the gravel and reached almost to mine. Mine still didn't seem to be there. The lantern light spread around my legs without catching on them the way it caught on hers. Brooke took a slow step backward. The sun was shining when I came through, she said. The road was dry. There were trees on both sides. Then everything went white, and I came out here. There's been fog on this road since 1988. Not where I was. You said it came 20 minutes ago. About that. The road doesn't change in 20 minutes. She looked toward the burned foundations she saw. I looked toward the houses I saw. We were both looking at the same place, and neither of us could make the other see it. The clocks had never kept true time in Marrow Hollow. Our kitchen clock kept bad time. Kinsley's had been wrong. Orion's had been stuck at 11:17 ever since. I had always thought that was just another thing the fog had damaged. The morning had never changed either. It had been gray when the fog arrived. It was gray now. The same road, the same fence, the same cold light pressed against every window. Brooke's phone said 2024. She said the town had burned 30 years ago. I looked at the date on her phone and then at the burned foundations she saw, and understood that both versions of Marrow Hollow occupied the same north road. I looked at Brooke and then at the road again. The houses were still there on my side. The burned foundations were still there on hers. Same gravel, same fence, same gray air. The only difference was that her shadow crossed the road and mine didn't. I held the lantern ahead of me. The flame was burning bright enough, but no heat reached my hand. I could see the light on Brooke's jacket. I could see it on the wet stones. The light never touched me. My boots were standing on the gravel, but there weren't any marks beneath them. Brooke's boots had left 2 clear prints where she stepped back. The mud had pressed up around the soles. I looked at my hands. The skin across my knuckles looked pale, not winter pale. There was a gray color underneath it that hadn't been there before. My fingers felt numb, like I'd held them in ice water. Ronnie, Brooke said, I'm here. You need to listen to me. I kept looking at my hands. The town burned. Yes. In 1988. That's what I told you. The fog came in 1988. I know. I looked past her toward the road. The fog was gathered there in a long wall, thick enough that the fence disappeared inside it. The houses of Marrow Hollow stood behind me with their lamps in the windows. The same lamps had been burning when I woke up that morning. The same gray morning had been there when Sierra left. The same clocks had been wrong for 30 years. Nobody had been living in that morning. We'd been kept in it. The thought came to me plain. The fire had taken the town, and whatever was left of us stayed where the fire had left us. The houses stood because we remembered them standing. The clocks didn't move because there wasn't anywhere for the time to go. Morning never became day because it had stopped being morning a long time ago. "Isabella's dead," I said. Brooke was quiet for a moment. I turned toward her. "She's in that house." "I know. She's my daughter." "I know, Ronnie. She died in the fire too." Brooke's face tightened. She looked like she wanted to say something that wouldn't make it worse. "The town is dead," she said. "Your family is dead." I shook my head. It wasn't that I thought she was wrong. I couldn't think what else to do with the words. Isabella had been in her room every night. She'd eaten food, she'd slept beside the lamp, she'd talked to me about her mother and the cat and the cold. She'd been real. So had I. I turned to the house where Isabella was waiting. Kinsley had been real too. She'd sat by her north window for days and watched the fence. I used to think the fog had found its way inside her. I thought it had pulled her names out one at a time until there wasn't enough of her left to fight it. But Kinsley hadn't been infected by anything. She'd been dying. Maybe she'd been dead already. Maybe all of us had. The fog had held her there until she was weak enough to move beyond it. Then those pale arms had reached through the boundary and taken what was ready to leave. The things in the fog hadn't lived in town. They weren't neighbors. They weren't people who'd been trapped in the fire with us. They were outside it, waiting on the other side. They took the ones who were ready. I thought of Kinsley's slippers in the road. Then I thought of Sierra's shoes. 3 years ago, Sierra had promised she'd be back before morning, standing right there on the gravel. She hadn't been attacked. She hadn't been dragged away while she was still alive. She'd died, and the fog had opened for her. She'd crossed the line. I had watched her go and called it something else because I couldn't bear the truth. The gray had spread past my knuckles by then. It looked like smoke beneath the skin. I bent my fingers and could barely feel them move. "Why is this happening?" I asked. Brooke moved toward me. "I don't know. You came through the fog. I came through a trail. You opened it. I didn't mean to." My hands started shaking. The lantern rattled against its handle and the flame jumped inside the glass. I tried to picture Sierra's face. I could see her hair. Brown hair pulled back from her eyes. I could see the shape of her coat. In the photograph, one hand rested on Isabella's shoulder. Her face wouldn't stay. I knew there had been a smile. I knew there was a crease beside her mouth. I knew there was a little crease beside her mouth, and one side of her hair had come loose near her ear. Those were pieces. They were all I had. I closed my eyes and tried harder. Nothing. "Sierra," I said. The name came out of me. I knew the name. I just couldn't find the face that belonged to it. "Ronnie, you have to come with me." I opened my eyes. Brooke was standing at the edge of the fog. Part of her jacket was in the clear daylight she saw, and part of it was washed gray by the air around me. Her shadow crossed the gravel behind her. It reached into the fog but didn't disappear. "Walk out this way," she said. "Come toward the sun." "I can't." "You can. I came through. Isabella's inside. Then bring her." I faced the house again. The front door was only a short walk away. It had always been a short walk away. I could have crossed it in a few seconds. The road tilted under my boots. "How long do I have?" Brooke looked toward the fog behind her. "I don't know." "Tell me." "I don't know, okay? I'm trying to figure this out too." She held up her phone. The screen was still lit, though it had no signal. "My being here is keeping the opening between our worlds from closing. I don't know why. Maybe it's because I'm alive and you're not. Maybe the fog needs something from one side to touch the other." "Can you take Isabella?" "If she reaches the seam, yes. A dead person can cross toward the things in the fog. or a living person can go back to 2024. That's what I've seen happen. Seen happen where? I haven't seen it happen. I mean, I know that's what this is. I know what I'm looking at. She rubbed her free hand over her face. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't look away from me. If I leave, the opening could close, she said. If it closes while you're still in there, then Isabella stays trapped in the gray. So do you. You won't get another chance to take her across. The gray had reached the first joints of my fingers. My hands looked thinner than they had a minute earlier. I could see the gravel through the edge of one thumb when I held it against the lantern light. I started toward home. Ronnie, wait. Isabella is inside. You need to walk out with me. I said I'm taking her across. I wasn't sure she'd heard me. I didn't stop to find out. The road moved beneath me in uneven steps. I kept hold of the lantern even though it gave me no warmth. The houses leaned in the fog. Their windows glowed yellow. Somewhere behind one of them, Isabella was waiting for me to come back. Brooke followed me from the northern road. She stayed half in the daylight and half in the gray, calling to me as she came. Ronnie, don't go too far. I reached the walk. Ronnie, listen. If the seam closes, you lose her. I climbed the steps. Gray spread through my hands, and Brooke Noble called after me from the open seam. I opened the door and stepped inside. The house looked the same as it had when I left it. The same cold room, the same table by the wall, the same second can of fuel sitting beside the door where I'd put it. Everything was where it belonged, which made it worse. Brooke was still outside calling after me. Ronnie, wait. You can't take her in there. I didn't answer. I went down the hall to Isabella's room carrying the lantern. The flame stayed steady behind the glass. It lit the walls and the floor and the edge of the bed. Isabella was curled up beneath the blanket. Her mother's old coat was still around her shoulders. She'd taken one sleeve off while sleeping, and her hand rested on top of the blanket. The light went through it. Not all the way. I could see the yellow glow between her fingers and the bones beneath the skin. Her hand looked thinner than it had that morning. It looked like something made from wax left too close to a window. I stood there for a second. Then I set the lantern down and touched her shoulder. Isabella. She moved a little but didn't wake up. I touched her again. Isabella, wake up. Her eyes opened. She looked at me without fear. She usually looked afraid when I woke her before daylight, but this time she just looked tired. Dad, I'm here. She looked toward the lantern. Why are you carrying the lantern? I picked it back up. We're going to the north fence together. She sat up slowly. The coat slid down one shoulder. Why? I need to take you somewhere. Where? The north fence. She frowned at that. Why do we have to go there? I didn't have a good answer that wouldn't tell her everything. The truth was she was already dead. The town was dead. The fog had kept us moving through the same morning for 3 decades, and it was starting to let go of her. I wasn't going to tell her that while she was sitting in bed with one hand shining through. We're going to meet Brooke, I said. Who is Brooke? I looked at her. She'd already forgotten. Not all of it. Just the name. Maybe it had been there when I woke her and disappeared while she slept. That was how it worked. A name went first, then the face, then the words. Orion had told me that, and I hadn't believed it enough. She's outside, I said. Is she nice? She's trying to help us. Isabella looked down at her hand. She turned it over and watched the light move through her palm. Why is my hand like that? I didn't answer right away. She looked at me. Dad? It's the fog. Am I sick? No. That wasn't true either, but sick wasn't the word for it. Sick meant there was something in you that could be fought. This was something leaving. She pulled the other hand out from beneath the coat. It was pale too, though not as clear as the first. I could see the lamp through the tips of her fingers. Will it go back? I wanted to say yes. I wanted to promise we'd go to the fence, come home, and she'd sleep until noon. I wanted to put the lantern on the table and leave her in that room where I could still pretend the rules worked. Keeping her there would only hold her in the fog. The lamp kept the house safe. That was what we'd always said. Keep the lantern burning and the fog stayed outside. But Isabella was already inside it in a way the lamp couldn't stop. Her body was hollowing out. If I left her in the room, then she'd lose more names, then faces, then speech. She'd sit beside the window like Kinsley had, waiting for something she couldn't remember wanting. If I carried her to Brooke and crossed the fence, she could reach an ending. I had no idea what came after that. Maybe there was nothing. Maybe the fog took her and I lost her anyway. But there was no ending in that house. There was only more morning and less of her. I reached down and picked her up. She was light in my arms. I knew that before, but I'd never carried her while part of her was disappearing. Her body fit against my chest and the coat bunched under my arm. She put both arms around my neck. Dad, where are we going? North. Is it cold? Some. She rested her cheek against my shoulder. I don't remember Brooke. I know. Did I know her before? No. Isabella didn't ask anything else. She looked over my shoulder at the room as I carried her out. Her bed was unmade. The blanket had fallen onto the floor. The little lamp beside the window burned with a weak yellow flame. I left it there. Brooke stood on the porch when I came outside. The daylight behind her made the fog look darker. I could see the road in both directions. In front of me were the houses and the fence. Behind Brooke were the blackened foundations and the trees growing through them. She looked at Isabella and then at me. You brought her. I said I would. I know. I just didn't know if you could. I stepped off the porch. The lantern hung from my right hand. Isabella was in my left arm and against my chest. Her coat covered most of her, but I could still see the pale shape of her fingers where they held my collar. Brooke moved backward to keep the space between us. Come toward me, she said. Don't go straight to the fence. The fence is north. Ronnie, listen, you need to come through the seam. I know where I'm going. You don't. You think you're walking to a fence, but that isn't what I see. I kept walking. The road was wet under my boots. The road had stayed wet my whole life. The lantern swung a little with every step and threw light over the gravel. Isabella's breath was cold against my neck. Brooke followed us from behind. She stayed near the open daylight but didn't let the fog close around her. Ronnie, come this way. I didn't look back. Ronnie, please. I looked down at Isabella. Her eyes were open. Are you scared? I asked. She shook her head against my coat. Where are we going? The north fence. Why? I held her tighter. Because I said I'm taking you across. She didn't ask what across meant. She put her face against me again and went quiet. I kept walking toward the fence post ahead. The fog had changed by then. It wasn't pressed flat against the road anymore. It stood in tall folds on both sides, with shapes moving inside it. I could see long arms hanging down, pale arms. They were too thin and too long, and the hands almost reached the ground. The reachers were there. They didn't come forward. They didn't reach for us. They stood along the road with their arms lowered and their bodies turned toward me. Some were close enough that I could have thrown a stone and hit them. I wasn't going to throw anything. Brooke stopped behind us. Ronnie, she said. I heard the fear in her voice. She'd seen them before, or something like them. She'd watched Kinsley go. She knew what the fog could do. I didn't stop. One of the pale forms shifted in the gray. It unfolded a little farther, like somebody waking up in a chair. Its head turned toward Isabella. I moved her face against my shoulder so she couldn't see it. "They're not moving," Brooke said. "I know. Why aren't they moving?" "I don't know." The Reachers had taken Kinsley because she was ready. They'd taken Sierra because she was dead. Isabella was dead too, but she wasn't ready to leave me. Maybe that was enough to keep them back. Maybe they were waiting for me to hand her over. I wasn't going to hand her over. The fence post stood ahead of us in the gravel. It leaned a little toward the road. The wood was dark with moisture and the wire ran from it into the fog on both sides. I passed the place where Kinsley had been taken. Her slippers were gone. The gravel held no mark, no torn cloth, no blood, no gray vapor. Nothing to show she'd ever stood there except the part of me that still saw her leaving. Isabella lifted her head. "Who lived here?" "Kinsley." She thought about the name. "I know that name." I looked at her face. "You do?" She nodded, though I didn't think she knew from where. Then she put her head back down. The Reachers stood on both sides of the road. Their long forms didn't move. I reached the fence post with Isabella in my arms. I got to the fence post with Isabella in my arms. The wood was slick under my shoulder when I leaned against it. The wire disappeared into the fog on either side. The road ended there as far as I knew. There was nowhere else to go except into the gray. Isabella lifted her head from my shoulder. "Where is Mama?" I looked at her. Her face was pale in the lantern glow. I could see the fence post through the loose strands of her hair, and the fog moved behind her like something breathing slow. I knew who she meant. "Sierra went ahead," I said. "She's waiting in a warm place. You'll find her there." Isabella watched me for a second. "Is she warm?" "Yes." "Does she have her coat?" "She does." I didn't know that. I didn't know whether it had a source, a cause, or only more fog beyond the road. But I knew Sierra had been cold when she left. She'd stood on the road in her dark coat with her hands tucked under her arms, and she'd looked back at me before she walked north. I'd told her I'd come after her. 3 years was plenty of time to keep somebody waiting. I set Isabella down beside the fence post. Her boots touched the wet gravel and she swayed a little. I caught her by the arm until she found her balance. She still had her mother's old coat on. It hung around her like it belonged to somebody twice her size. The lantern swayed from my hand. Its light went across the road and caught the fence wire, but it didn't put any warmth into the air. I could feel the cold moving through my fingers. They'd gone numb a while ago. Now the numbness had reached my wrists. Isabella held out her hand. I took it. Her fingers were small and colder than mine. That didn't seem possible, but it was true. I wrapped my hand around hers and kept her close to the fence post. The Reachers lined the road. They'd been there when I came up. I hadn't paid much attention to them because I was carrying Isabella and trying to keep my feet under me. Now they started to move. Not all at once. One shifted farther into the road, then another. Their long bodies leaned out of the gray. I could see the pale skin on their arms and the fingers hanging almost to the gravel. Their heads were bent toward Isabella. She kept her eyes off them. "Are they waiting?" she asked. "I think so." "For us?" I squeezed her hand. "Maybe." That wasn't much of an answer. I didn't have a better one. Kinsley had been ready when they took her. They'd taken Sierra after she died. They hadn't touched Isabella while she was in the house. Maybe the lamp had kept them back. Maybe she hadn't been ready then. Or maybe I'd been the thing holding them off. The gray beneath my skin had reached past my wrists. It looked darker where it crossed the backs of my hands. The lantern's glow showed through the edge of my thumb. A thin, bright line of gravel showed through it. Isabella watched where our hands were joined. "Dad? I'm here. Your hand looks funny." "I know. Are you hurt?" "No." That wasn't exactly true. I wasn't hurt the way a person gets hurt. There wasn't any blood, nothing was broken. I was coming apart. Her eyes went back to the road. One of the reachers had come near, its arm resting against the fog beside us. The arm was pale and jointed. It bent in the middle in the wrong place. She hadn't fought. She hadn't screamed. She just kept walking north while I watched her go, telling myself she'd come back. I let go of her hand. Not all the way at first. I loosened my fingers and felt hers slip against my palm. She looked up at me. Her face held no fear. She looked tired, the way she'd looked when I woke her in her room. I could have held on. That was the worst part. My hand still worked. I could have pulled her against me and carried her back to the house. I could have kept the lantern burning and made her sleep near the window. We could have stayed there through another morning and another one after that. She'd forget my face eventually. Maybe she'd forget Sierra's name. Maybe she'd forget the house. Maybe she'd forget what it meant to be afraid. I could keep her from the fog for a while, but I couldn't keep the fog from taking pieces of her. I had already done this once. I'd let Sierra walk north because I couldn't stop her. This time I knew what I was doing. "Isabella," I said. She looked at me. "Are you going to stay with me?" "I don't know." That was the truth. It was the first one I could give her. The reacher came out of the fog. Its arm unfolded toward us. It moved slowly at first, like it had to work its way through thick water. The elbow bent too far. The hand opened and closed once. Isabella's fingers were still resting in mine. I released them. Her hand dropped to her side. The pale arm wrapped around her waist. She didn't cry out. The reacher pulled her back against it, and the front of her coat lifted away from her body. I stepped forward without meaning to, but my legs wouldn't move right. My boots slid on the gravel and the lantern struck my knee. "Isabella." She turned her head toward me. The reacher pulled her into the gray a little farther. Its arm crossed her chest. I could see her face between the pale fingers. She wasn't afraid. That hurt worse than if she'd screamed. I tried to catch her, but she was already beyond my hand. The fog closed around her shoulders. Her hair disappeared. Then the top of her coat. Then her face. I kept my hand out until there was nothing left to reach for. The reacher pulled Isabella into the gray until only her small shoes remained on the gravel beside the final post. The shoes didn't move. They sat side by side in the gravel where Isabella had been standing, small and wet, and pointed toward the fog. I held my hand out for a while. I don't know how long. She was gone and my hand was empty, but I kept it there like she might come back and take it. "Ronnie." Brooke's voice came from behind me. She sounded farther away than she was. I lowered my hand and looked toward her. She stood on the other side of the open seam with the daylight behind her. Her jacket looked too bright for the road, too clean. "You need to come now," she said. I turned back to the fog. The reachers were still there. I could see them through the gray, their pale arms hanging down and their heads turned toward the place where Isabella had disappeared. They hadn't followed her. They hadn't come after me either. "Ronnie, come on." I picked up the lantern. I'd set it down when I reached for Isabella, and it had tipped onto its side in the gravel. The flame was still burning behind the glass. It looked smaller than before, but it was steady. Brooke came toward me, then stopped at the edge of the seam. "Leave the lantern," she said. I looked at her. "Just come through. You don't need it anymore." That wasn't true. The lantern had been the first thing I checked every morning. It was the thing I'd carried from room to room when the fog crowded the windows. It was the reason we kept the doors shut and the curtains drawn. It was the one rule that had stayed simple. Keep the lamp burning. I thought about all the nights Isabella had slept beside it. I thought about the little lamp in her room, still burning by the window. That one hadn't kept her from hollowing out. It hadn't kept the fog from getting inside her. Maybe the lamps never kept anything out. Maybe they only kept us in. "I can't leave it," I said. "You can. You need to. Isabella's gone." "I know. I can't leave her here by herself." Brooke turned to the fog. "She's not by herself." I knew what she meant. The Reachers were out there. Whatever waited beyond them was out there too. It wasn't the answer I wanted, but there wasn't another answer. Brooke rubbed her hands together. She was cold. I could tell by the way she held her arms close to her body. The living got cold. I used to think that was just one more thing to complain about, but now it seemed like proof of something. "Ronnie, please." I looked at the open seam behind her. The road on her side was dry. Trees stood along it with bare branches and a little light gathered between them. I couldn't see the blackened foundations from where I stood, but I knew they were there. I knew that was the place she came from. 2024. A whole world past the fog. I could step toward it. Brooke had done it. She'd come through the trail and found us on the road. She said I could go back with her. She said I was dead, and the dead didn't belong in the daylight. That was probably true. I put the lantern on top of the fence post. The wood was wet and black under my hand. The flame made a small yellow patch on the gravel. Brooke took another step. "What are you doing?" "Nothing. You're not coming through." I didn't answer. I watched the lantern flame move behind the glass. It leaned when the wind passed, then straightened again. The lantern wasn't warm against my fingers anymore. I could barely feel the metal handle when I picked it back up. The gray had reached my elbows. I checked my arms. The skin was pale and thin. The dark color underneath had spread in uneven patches, like smoke trapped under ice. My coat sleeve sagged where my arm had lost some of its weight. Brooke saw it too. "Ronnie, you don't have much time." "How much?" "I don't know." "Tell me." "I don't know, okay?" She looked angry when she said it, but it wasn't anger at me. She was scared and didn't know where to put it. I understood that. I'd been doing the same thing for 30 years. "I can still get you out," she said. "You just have to walk this way." I faced the daylight. She was right there. It wasn't far. A few steps, maybe less than that. I could have crossed over and stood beside her. I could have felt the sun on my face if the sun was warm. I could have found out what the outside world looked like when it wasn't covered in gray. But the shoes were still in the gravel. I couldn't take Isabella across. I couldn't follow her into the fog. I couldn't go back to a world where she didn't exist and pretend that was a life. None of them were good. There was just the choice I could stand to make. "I said I'm taking her across," I told Brooke. She stared at me. "You already let her go." "I know." "Then come with me." I shook my head. "Ronnie." I turned toward the fence post. The Reachers hadn't moved. Their arms still hung beside them, pale against the fog. One of them stood close to the shoes. Its hand was almost touching the gravel. I wondered if it could see me. I wondered if it knew I was staying. The lantern sat between us on the post. It had kept the dead houses lit. It had kept the windows yellow and the rooms in place. It had kept the clock stopped and the morning from ending. Every night I filled it with oil and told myself I was protecting Isabella. I wasn't protecting her. I was keeping her here. The thought was plain enough that I didn't argue with it. The lamp had held everyone in Marrow Hollow. It had held Sierra. It had held Kinsley. It had held me. Maybe the fog needed the light. Maybe the light was the thing that gave the fog something to hold. I reached for the lantern. Brooke moved forward. "Don't." I took it off the fence post. "Ronnie, wait." I set it on the ground beside Isabella's shoes. The flame shone through the glass and made a little circle of yellow around them. The shoes looked like they belonged to a child who'd gone outside and would be back soon. That was how things worked in the town. Everything looked ready for somebody to come home. I unscrewed the top. The flame burned low inside the lantern. It was a small thing, just oil and fire and glass, nothing that should have had the power to hold a town together. I put my mouth near the opening. "Ronnie, don't do this." I looked at Brooke once more. Her face was wet. I don't know if it was rain or tears. She was still on the living side and I was still on mine. Then I blew out the lantern beside the fence post and remained on the Marrow Hollow side as the fog dissolved me. I stayed where I was for a few seconds after Ronnie disappeared. The lantern had gone dark. The yellow circle on the gravel was gone. All that remained on his side of the fence was gray fog and two small shoes sitting beside the post. I could still see them even though the seam had started to close. It pulled in at the edges like a curtain being drawn from both sides. The blackened foundations behind me blurred and thinned. The trees on the trail came through next, then the fence post. Ronnie had put the lantern down beside the shoes and blown it out. I kept expecting him to change his mind. Maybe he'd pick it back up. Maybe he'd come through after me. People do that in movies anyway. They make the hard choice and then find a way to undo it before anybody has to live with it. Ronnie didn't. I stepped backward through the opening. The cold went away first, then the smell of wet ash. My boots landed on the cedar loop trail and the seam snapped shut in front of me. There was no flash or loud noise. It just folded into itself and became a patch of gray morning between two trees. I waited for the road to show back up. It didn't. The trail looked the way it had before. Brown dirt, dead leaves, bare branches overhead. The air smelled like pine and damp soil instead of smoke and something rotten. I could hear a bird somewhere farther down the trail. It made one short call and then stopped. I checked my hands. They were still my hands. No gray under the skin. No light shining through my fingers. No dark patches spreading up my arms. I turned them over twice just to make sure. That was when I started shaking. I sat down on the edge of the trail and put my head between my knees. I wasn't hurt. I hadn't fallen. Nothing had happened to my body that I could see, but I was shaking hard enough that my teeth clicked together. I kept thinking about Ronnie asking me not to leave yet. He hadn't said it like a threat. He hadn't said it because he wanted me trapped there. He'd said it because Isabella was gone and he didn't know what else to do. He'd been carrying that lantern for so long that he couldn't imagine setting it down, even with nothing left to protect. I understood that part. I just didn't understand how somebody could choose the fog when the way out was right in front of him. After a while, I stood up and started down the trail. It couldn't have been more than half an hour, but the hike felt longer than it had on the way in. I kept looking over my shoulder. Every time I did, the trail was empty. No gray road, no burned town, no pale arms between the trees. Just me and the woods and the sound of my own boots. I had my phone in my pocket. I took it out once to check the time, but the screen was scratched and my hand was still trembling, so I put it away. The date was still there, 2024. That was the part that made sense. I found the other hikers near the trailhead. There were 3 of them gathered beside the map board. One man had a red pack and a walking stick. A woman was drinking from a metal bottle. The third was younger than both of them and had his hands shoved into the pockets of a gray sweatshirt. They all looked over when I came out of the trees. The woman lowered her bottle. "Are you okay?" "Yeah." I wasn't, but it was the first answer that came to me. The man with the red pack looked past me into the woods. "Were you alone?" I glanced back. The trail behind me was quiet. The morning light had come up a little while I was gone, though it was still gray under the trees. The space between the trees held no road. The town was gone too. The little girl's shoes weren't beside the fence. "Yes," I said. The younger hiker pulled his hands out of his sweatshirt pockets. "Did you get lost?" "No." That answer sounded worse than the first one. The woman moved toward me. "Do you need us to call somebody?" I thought about calling somebody. The police, search and rescue, anybody who might have a number for the dead. I pictured trying to explain the seam and the fog and a man who had stayed behind because his daughter was gone. I pictured saying Isabella's name and hearing it disappear from the air. "No," I said. "Don't call anyone." The man with the red pack looked at the other two. "Maybe we should get her back to the parking lot." "I can walk." Nobody argued with me. That was good. I didn't want to be touched. I didn't want to explain why my jacket was wet or why I kept staring at the space between the trees. We started toward the trailhead together. The path was wide enough for 2 people, so I walked along the edge and let them stay in front of me. Their shoes made ordinary sounds on the dirt. Leaves crushed under their soles. The walking stick tapped every few steps. It was the most normal thing I'd heard all morning. The woman turned around as she walked. "Were you out here all night?" "No." "Did you see anyone else?" I almost said yes. I kept my eyes on the trail. There was a pine cone near my boot. It had been split open by something and the seeds were gone. "There was a man," I said. The hikers slowed down. "What man?" the younger one asked. I could see Ronnie at the fence post, his coat sleeve sagging around an arm that was becoming smoke. His hand still reaching after Isabella was already gone. The little shoes sitting in the gravel. He'd asked me not to leave yet. "I don't know," I said. "He lives out there." The man with the red pack frowned. "Lives where?" I stopped walking. The others stopped too. For a second, nobody said anything. The woods were quiet around us. No birds this time. No wind. Just the 4 of us standing on the trail with the map board somewhere ahead. I looked at each of their faces. "If you hear a man asking you to stay," I said, "don't answer him." The younger hiker gave a nervous laugh. "What?" "Don't answer him. Don't go looking for him." The woman lowered her bottle. "Is he hurt?" "I don't know." "Then what are we supposed to do?" "Keep walking." The man with the red pack looked back down the trail. "Is this some kind of joke?" "No." I could hear how I sounded. I knew how it looked. A stranger comes out of the trees and tells you not to answer an unseen man. That isn't something a reasonable person says. I would have thought the same thing yesterday. But yesterday I hadn't seen a road that belonged to a dead town. I hadn't watched a little girl disappear into fog. I hadn't watched the man carrying the lantern decide there was no way back. "Don't search for the shoes either," I said. That got their attention. "What shoes?" the woman asked. I looked behind me once more. The trail was still empty. "Just don't." Nobody spoke after that. We kept moving toward the trailhead. The man with the red pack walked faster. The younger hiker stayed close to the woman. They didn't ask me anything else, and I was glad because I didn't have any more answers. The trees thinned ahead. Beyond them was the parking area and the road and the rest of the living world. Cars would pass there. Phones would work. People would complain about the weather and ask how far it was to the next overlook. That was how it should be. I let the hikers go ahead of me. Before they reached the trailhead, I called after them. "Listen." They turned around. "If you hear him ask you to stay, keep walking. If you see shoes lying in the road, leave them there.